Su. This is Australian warship, sir.
In 2003, a covert investigation of North Korean criminal activities across the globe had its first break. The U.S. State Department led the operation.
One of our first very significant actions was with the Australian government to seize a North Korean ship tied into their intelligence service called the Pong Su. We received information that it was going to be leaving North Korea, and it likely had a significant amount of illicit drugs on board. I decided I would call the commander of U.S. Pacific Fleet, and lo and behold, we were able to order up an attack submarine to trail this ship.
Raise the multifunction mast.
And we trailed that ship all the way down to Southeast Asia into Australia.
Unknown at the time, a North Korean Communist Party official was also on board, potentially connecting a crime to the North Korean regime.
The Australian Special Air Service, SAS, boarded the ship, captured the crew, carrying 50 kilograms of heroin and a large amount of arms as well.
Have you been expelled from Australia?
Why?
Was your government involved in drug smuggling into Australia?
No,
Not at all.
not at all.
It was only just several months since they had established diplomatic relations with North Korea, and they were welcoming the North Koreans to their country. And I remember warning the Australian National Security Advisor, he might seriously regret this, and they came to realize that opening yourself up diplomatically to North Korea is opening yourself up to North Korean criminal activity.
North Korea is exporting not only missiles, but as we saw in an Australian bus the other day, drugs. So this is a regime that thrives in criminality.
They're trafficking in methamphetamines. They're trafficking in counterfeit drugs, medications, to include Viagra, counterfeit cigarettes. They're exporting training, exporting small arms, all kinds of military equipment up to including missiles.
U.S. intelligence officials can draw a direct line between North Korea's vast criminal empire and the dynastic empire that rules the country. 3 generations of brutal dictators, hungry for wealth, strength, and a place among the world's military superpowers. Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea, first flexed his muscles following World War II. Bolstered by the Soviet Union, he boldly invaded South Korea to unify the peninsula. After nearly 3 years and 4 million casualties, US-led UN troops forced the North into a peace treaty. To secure his power in the face of defeat, Kim and his loyalists wage a new kind of war: propaganda. Creating a narrative steeped in Confucianism, Christianity, and ancient Korean legends, he set about turning himself and his heirs into protectors, saviors, gods.
In building the cult of personality, Kim Il-sung drew on Korea's heritage of 5,000 years of royal rule. And North Korea today still operates very much like a monarchy. You have an absolute ruler who relies on his court, relies on, in modern North Korea, that would be the elites, to support him and to carry out his policies.
Korea has a long history of being taken over by foreign invaders. The Japanese were the last, expelled from the peninsula after World War II, ending 35 years of cruel occupation. The Kim propaganda machine took advantage of this history. The North believe only the Kims will keep them safe from hostile imperialist powers.
Korea is a tiny country, And there's a proverb, shrimp among whales. It has always been a tiny country sandwiched among superpowers. And Korea has always been aware that if they're not careful about how they see themselves and protect themselves, that they will just be crowded out or stepped on or taken over by these foreign powers. And so much of their history has been about fighting off foreign invasion. Kim Il-sung was incredibly savvy in using this Korean mentality to his advantage.
It's a form of extreme nationalism and something that Kim had been talking about, using different vocabulary going back to the 1930s when he fought the Japanese in Manchuria for 10 years. North Korea, much more than South Korea, is the inheritor of Korean political culture. They always kept foreigners at arm's length. It's not isolationism so much as exclusionism, holding foreigners at arm's length. It's in many ways the most basic characteristic of North Korea.
The regime maintains firm control of its people, their movement, what they say, and what they do. All news, media, and entertainment are produced by the state and expounds propaganda scripted to promote the Kims and their benevolence. Meanwhile, this tiny nation, the size of Pennsylvania, has plagued the outside world with a steady barrage of blatant criminal and overtly aggressive attacks for decades.
(1968) was an absolute crisis in the United States. In the midst of this, Kim Il-sung seizes the Pueblo, which was an American spy ship, and kept the crew for 11 months. I imagine they expected a big bundle of money in return for the crew and maybe the Pueblo. When they didn't get it, they kept the Pueblo.
Feeling emboldened, Kim flexes his muscles again.
Very shortly after Richard Nixon was inaugurated, the North Koreans tested him by shooting down an EC-121 surveillance aircraft that had been going along their borders.
This attack was unprovoked. It was deliberate. It was without warning.
Despite the brazen attack, the U.S. did not retaliate.
In the 1980s, they carried out a terrible terrorist attack on the South Korean cabinet in Rangoon, Burma, wiping out almost half of the cabinet and narrowly missing the president. North Korea was then accused of blowing an airliner out of the sky, killing hundreds of people just before the 1988 Olympics. And so North Korea got on a list of terrorist nations.
When you look at the history of provocations, you know, not only the Pueblo and the EC-121 shoot down, the attempted assassination of Park Chung-hee. The sinking of the Cheonun, 46 South Korean sailors were murdered by a torpedo attack by the North.
The torpedo that sunk the Cheonun and took the lives of 46 South Korean sailors was fired by a North Korean submarine.
1976, the axe murder at Panmunjom. 2 American soldiers were brutally killed by North Koreans. That's really the only time we really demonstrated strength. South Korean and U.S. military forces, B-52 bombers in the air, carrier battle groups at sea, entire infantry battalions in helicopters hovering along the DMZ. The North Koreans backed off, and they didn't respond. And I think there's a lesson that I think is lost on all of us, is that North Korea will not attack or not respond into strength. If you demonstrate power and strength, they're not going to attack. They're looking for weakness and vulnerability, and that's what they've always exploited.
Their attitude toward the rest of the world easily becomes both criminal and extortionist. In other words, if you're seen as a criminal regime, why not act like a criminal? Why not get what you can get out of it?
I mean, it's really political warfare. Blackmail diplomacy, use provocations, kinetic and non-kinetic, to gain political and economic concessions. That's really at the heart of what I like to call the Kim family regime's long con, or their political warfare. We say that war is a continuation of politics by other means. But you know, most of the revisionist powers, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, look at politics as war by other means. And so they're practicing this political diplomacy, you know, based on threat, you know, and maintaining the threshold below war, but using all means at their command to achieve their objectives.
These provocations and the advancement of their nuclear programs caused the international community to place a series of economic sanctions on North Korea for most of its existence.
Sanctions have been with us since ancient Greek times, so economic statecraft has been enormously potent. What we see in the current example, though, North Korea has been the subject of a number of sanctions. And as North Korea has improved in its capabilities, the types of sanctions have also grown in a very sophisticated manner as well.
The Security Council first adopted the resolution on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, nuclear issue, 24 years later, and despite extensive efforts, the challenged has defied resolution.
Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself.
대륙간 탄도 로켓 장착용 수소탄 시험에서 완전 성공.
Sanctions look more and more like antibiotics. And if you think of antibiotics being applied on a target over and over again, in some instances, you see the organism developing this drug resistance, this superbug trait. With the increasing application of these sanctions, you're seeing the North Korean regime in those instances where they bounce back and have that kind of resiliency.
What's hiding in plain sight is that our sanctions are not being adequately enforced. I would argue that North Korea is not contained, it's not deterred, it's not dissuaded. It's actually somewhat encouraged to continue its activities because of our inadequate enforcement mechanisms.
For decades, sanctions were futile because North Korea's economy was strategically propped up by the Soviet Union and supported by China.
It was a false economy in the North. But when the wall came down, China demanded payment for everything. And so that's what really crashed the North Korean economy. It produced a lot of heavy industry, it produced a lot of military equipment, but it didn't contribute and participate really in the international marketplace. So it was a subsistence or an aid-based type economy.
The Kims entered a new economic era, one that could not sustain the world's fourth largest military, pursue nuclear ambitions, and above all, keep the top 1% in riches. So Kim Jong-il, the heir apparent to the virtual throne, turns his attention to creating new revenue streams. He begins to formalize a state-sponsored criminal network to skirt sanctions and raise hard currency. It is called Office 39, a formalized war room that's not tasked with battle, but the procurement of goods and cash and a pipeline of illicit exports.
Office 39 is basically the part of the North Korean government that is dedicated to all of the illegal activity around the world. It was set up by Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un's father, and the goal was to find new revenue sources for the family and for the regime. Whether it's money laundering or drug dealing or arms sales, almost all of that is in one way or another connected to Office 39, which is really at the heart of the survival strategy of the Kim family. The way the North Korean system is organized is there's a relatively small percentage of the population that gets everything, and everybody else gets nothing. And so the people who get everything, they get all of the rewards of society. Meager as they may seem to us, they're a lot compared to everybody else. And those people are encouraged to feel that their fortunes will rise or fall with the Kim family.
Certainly, with Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung, smuggling luxury goods into North Korea was a huge part of how they kept their court economy happy and functioning. And that meant, it was like Rolex watches, Hennessy cognac. Kim Jong-il and Hennessy confirmed that for a 2-year period, he was the world's largest buyer of Hennessy cognac. Racked up bills of almost, I think it was $800,000 per year, hopefully not just for himself.
But the mechanism of Office 39 goes much deeper than acquiring trinkets to buy the elite's loyalty.
If you think of Office 39 in terms of a Western sense, there is nothing directly equivalent. But there is a phenomenon called family offices. Family offices take care of all the business, all of the related activities of the family company. In many respects, Office 39 has those type of capabilities in the sense of making revenue for the North Korean regime and the Kim family.
Kim Il-sung designed this system to do one thing, to keep him and his successors in power. We always say that survival of the Kim family regime is the single vital interest of the North. And so, which is just like a mafia-like crime family. And he uses ruthless tactics, purges, and illicit activities to make money. So it's very much like a mafia-like organization.
It's become much more institutionalized as the walls came down and the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and China didn't provide as much financial support as North Korea needed. The illicit activities just went on a tear. We came to call North Korea the Soprano state. The leadership, all the way up to the Kim family themselves, were overseeing the transnationally organized crime activity.
As a young economist and senior advisor in Colin Powell's State Department, David Asher began to make connections about how North Korea remained in business and how, by going after the money, could perhaps topple the Kim regime without firing a shot.
We observed that North Korea was running roughly $1 billion trade deficit and had been for years, sometimes going higher than that. It didn't make any sense as an economist. As we started to probe it, we came up with pretty definitive information that they were engaged in state-level criminality as a source of income and making between $800 million to $1.2 billion, we calculated, a year in income from criminal activity.
Asher began to assemble what would become a 3-year-long enterprise. Running a West Coast undercover investigation was FBI Special Agent Bob Hamer. It was codenamed Operation Smoking Dragon.
You're pretty autonomous as an undercover agent. I mean, there's certain rules, parameters. You have to operate within certain guidelines, but most of it, it's up to you. Prior to Operation Smoking Dragon, I had successfully posed as a contract killer on a couple different occasions. I was a drug dealer, a high roller. I worked gangs in South Central Los Angeles. When I first received the phone call from the case agent stating that they needed an undercover agent to look into counterfeit cigarettes, I kind of laughed because it didn't seem like it was that important an issue until he explained to me why the FBI was looking into counterfeit cigarettes.
The reason was twofold. One, to discover what was coming into the container ports of Los Angeles, California, the busiest in the U.S. And two, to track organized crime members moving fake cigarettes going to mom-and-pop grocery stores run by Middle Easterners, with some using proceeds to support terrorism.
This was significant activity, and it was happening right under our noses. And we thought that the counterfeit smokes were coming out of China, and they were, but they were being produced in North Korea. We identified 14 different North Korean factories making counterfeit cigarettes, so it was the largest counterfeit cigarette operation in the world and may well continue to be.
Hamer met with an informant who would lead him to his first contact, a Chinese national, and the shadowy world of Asian organized crime. FBI Special Agent Bob Hamer began his undercover sting operation into the smuggling of illicit goods from North Korea.
We rented a warehouse out in the Pomona area of California. We had our technical guys that fixed up the warehouse, I mean, straight out of Hollywood. So we had audio and video cameras. We were able to record every meeting that we had with the bad guys.
1 month later, Hamer got his first test.
He contacted us again to say that he had a 40-foot container of counterfeit cigarettes that he had smuggled into the United States. He wanted to store them at our warehouse, and he needed those cigarettes moved back to the East Coast to a group of Russian mob guys that were moving counterfeit cigarettes into New York City. Everything went smoothly. Then my credibility soared because I did what I said I was going to do. Nobody was arrested. There were no issues. So at that point, I became golden to him, and the word quickly spread throughout this Asian criminal syndicate that they had a guy that could help and do what they wanted. They started bringing me all sorts of contraband.
The targets began offering illicit drugs to Hamer: ecstasy, crystal meth, and counterfeit Viagra.
The path of the goods was North Korea, into China, and then into the United States.
David Asher continued to monitor Pacific Ocean shipping lanes, busting more North Korean vessels.
I encountered some information that implied that the North Koreans were shipping methamphetamine through the port of Busan. That's when I really woke up that the scale of this activity was huge for a little regime. We went down to Busan and cracked one 40-foot container full of methamphetamine. I think it was the largest amount of methamphetamine ever witnessed in Asia at the time. It was unbelievable scale of their meth production and their distribution network around the world with organized criminal groups. That container alone, I don't know if we could calculate adequately what it was worth. I mean, you know, several $100 million, maybe more. And it was such an embarrassment to the South Korean government that they ordered their intelligence folks to basically take the meth, take it out into the mouth of Busan Harbor and dump it. That was a real problem with South Korea, and it continues to be a problem, that they're really not willing to police their northern neighbor. We actually seized with another government in Asia 2 500-kilogram shipments of heroin, which were worth over $1 billion. So this was really serious money for the Kim regime, and that was getting picked off.
The money often gets laundered through casinos in the Philippines and Macau. Then operatives of Office 39 will move cash into banks for the regime. Macau is also a well-known ally in the North's drug trade, home to trading companies meant to procure and distribute both legal and illegal goods.
Office 39 is the heart of the Royal Court economy. So it is what really funds. It generates the hard currency around the world. And so you have this network. They are dealing with banks. They are laundering money, all to generate hard currency and to get it back to the North.
As Asher and his team followed the money, they identified Banco Delta Asia in Macau and pressured the bank to freeze Kim family coffers.
I wanted to make sure that we had our undercover operation not just targeting the illicit activities, but the actual money, the proceeds, so that we could understand what was being generated and we could target it judicially. Without revealing exactly how we were inside that bank, we managed to penetrate it and gain significant intelligence about its activities and realized that it was one of several banks in Macau that they were using. That caused a crisis inside Pyongyang that really affected Kim's confidence.
As the noose tightened around Kim's criminal ring, Bob Hamer's undercover operation continued to expand.
We actually were shocked that it went well beyond the counterfeit cigarettes. I mean, obviously, we have the counterfeit cigarettes, we have the ecstasy, we have the crystal meth. At one point, my case agent says, we really should get some weapons. I know you wouldn't believe this if you saw it in a movie, but I'm literally driving down the Pomona Freeway. One of our main targets is in the passenger seat. And I said to him, look, one of my clients owns a PMC, a private military company in Alabama. He gets hired out by third world countries. He needs automatic weapons. Can you throw in a case of AK-47s in your next container of counterfeit cigarettes? Just then, a flatbed National Guard truck goes by with a tank on it. And he looks at me and he says, I get you tank. He said, I can get you anything but nuclear weapons. You know, we wanted like a 9mm to put on the press conference table to make this thing look like it's important. The next thing we know, we are negotiating for a $60 million shoulder-fire missile deal for QW-2 missiles. We have the weapons conspiracy, and now the FBI says, do you think you can get the supernote?
The U.S. Secret Service had been tracking forged currency from North Korea for nearly 20 years. The supernote was a perfect counterfeit $100 bill.
North Korea is so good at counterfeiting that when they look and examine bills, they can tell if it's a counterfeit bill from North Korea because it's actually higher quality than the U.S. printed bill.
I mean, the North Koreans didn't make enormous amounts of money from it, but the disruptive effect on the U.S. dollar was significant. We had to redesign our $100 bill twice, which was an expensive task, costing hundreds of millions of dollars, just because of North Korea.
Finally, two separate individuals brought me the supernote. I told them that the test was it had to go through the self-service machine at Home Depot. And if the bills couldn't go through that, then I wasn't interested. We were told that it was a minimum purchase of $1 million worth of supernote, but it was 35 cents on a dollar, so it was a $350,000 upfront purchase for $1 million of the supernote. Those supernotes were delivered in a 20-foot container that was stacked full of hundreds of rolls of fabric. Eventually, we come to the end of the container, and it was obvious that the first 4 rolls of fabric were the ones that contained the money.
The transaction went down without a hitch, upping Hamer's value to the regime.
One of our main players came over from China. I met with him, and I was told that North Korea was going to make me the exclusive distributor of the supernote in the United States, and they were going to give me $40 million a year to distribute. The benefit to North Korea was the more money they could distribute, the more money they were going to make to finance the regime.
At this point, the FBI decided it was time to wrap up the operation.
I set up a couple meetings with the bad guys. I would meet up with a few. The FBI would come in and arrest us all. They'd put everyone in separate interview rooms. They'd kick me out the back door, and I'd go set up another meeting. Then I'd get arrested a second time. We'd wrap all those people up, kick me loose, and we'd do a third operation.
In New Jersey, outside of Atlantic City, the FBI was wrapping up a twin investigation named Operation Royal Charm. As with Operation Smoking Dragon in Los Angeles, the sting was targeting Asian criminal syndicates with ties to North Korea. However, this investigation recruited a unique team of undercover agents, made men inside the infamous Gambino organized crime family.
We started receiving information that Kim Jong-il was in love with the TV show The Sopranos. I approached the FBI in 2003, and they read me into their most sensitive case in the entire federal law enforcement, which was the penetration of the Gambino crime family and Italian mob.
The agents infiltrated the New York crime family for nearly a decade, fooling everyone, including the Teflon Don himself, John Gotti.
The North Koreans were just so enamored with the agents who they thought were Gambinos, and indeed they were in the Gambinos. So this was It was one of the most elaborate sting operations we've ever executed in U.S. law enforcement, and unbelievably, it worked.
The agents met with high-level North Koreans at a resort in Thailand. There, they struck a deal for $1 million in supernotes and military-grade weapons.
We were buying whatever the North Koreans would sell us. They proposed to sell 2,000 shoulder-launched missiles. Our agents made it clear that those were going to go to terrorists, and they had no problem with it.
To catch the crooks, the FBI staged an elaborate wedding of one of the agents in New Jersey on a rented yacht, christened the Royal Charm.
They came from around the world, mostly from Asia, because they wanted to see, the Gambinos getting married.
They never made it to the wedding. Limousines driven by FBI agents picked up the criminal wedding guests and drove them straight to booking.
It was shocking to them when they got arrested. The North Koreans really thought they had us in a position where we had let our guard down and they could interact with the world in a criminal fashion with unabated zeal. We truly threw them off balance, and that was a good thing.
In all, 87 individuals were charged.
While there is no wedding to celebrate New Jersey today, there is some cause for celebration to be able to bring this 4+ year investigation to a conclusion.
The North Korean criminal enterprise is extremely complex and distributed and diverse. So there were front companies all over the world. There were trading companies. There were all kinds of individuals connected to embassies, connected to quote-unquote private businesses who were distributed all around, who were part of this illicit network.
North Koreans permitted to live outside the country, whether conducting business on behalf of Office 39, or government officials detailed to embassies, are required to support their lifestyle and produce wealth for the regime, called loyalty payments.
North Korea's embassies overseas played an integral role. Ambassadors played a key role in overseeing and orchestrating the smuggling of luxury goods that went straight to the Kim family coffers, as well as to whatever fund was used to dole out gifts to the elites.
Vigilant investigations resulting in the expulsion of diplomats and officials go back decades. Their fear of the Kim family remained stronger than fear of arrest.
So it's important to understand that some of their diplomacy overseas does mean that these embassies become sort of a way station or a procurement station for goods that they want to smuggle back to keep that economy intact.
North Korea really has never been able to effectively participate in the international financial system, and which really is a big part of why we have sanctions, because North Korea's illicit activities, and they just cannot be allowed to access the international financial system. They adapt, so when they lose access to the banking system, one of the things that had been happening is Air Koryo, their airline, the flight attendants would always have to carry an extra suitcase because they would have to bring back one suitcase filled with cash because it couldn't be processed through the international monetary system, so they would carry hard currency, physically carry it. Again, they're innovative, creative, and resilient.
We shouldn't forget what the life is like for the rest of the North Koreans who aren't part of their core economy, who aren't members of the elites. When the Soviets and the Americans decided to divide up the Korean Peninsula in 1945, they did so at the 38th parallel. But that division, that arbitrary division, was devastating for the people of the North. The northern half of Korea is incredibly mountainous. It's 85% mountains. They have very little arable land, very little land to farm. And that's something to remember, that they absolutely can't feed their own people. They simply don't have the natural resources for it. The CIA estimates, and these numbers are a couple years old, but they estimate that North Korea's GDP per capita is $1,700. South Korea, on the other hand, is more than 39,000 per capita. I mean, we think about the difference.
As someone who spent a lot of time in South Korea, and just seeing the miracle of South Korea and the hard work of the South Koreans and what that's made possible. I saw the same people, the same work ethic in North Korea, but it was all being used as part of just this sinister machine that kept these incredible people down solely for the benefit of one family and a relatively small percentage of people around them.
Very few journalists are able to get into the countryside or into the smaller cities to see what life is like in the rougher parts of North Korea. But I think it's important to remember that this is how most North Koreans live. They live without electricity, without clean water, without heat, without plumbing. More than 40% of the population, 40%, does not have access to clean water, food. So the picture that we have right now in the media of North Korea, of Pyongyang being a modern metropolis, a country that's able to afford nuclear weapons, is only a tiny piece of the picture.
It's a criminal state not only conducting criminal activity in the ways that we've described through finance and shipping and counterfeiting and trafficking in drugs, but it's a criminal state identified by the United Nations as conducting crimes against humanity. North Korea is conducting crimes against humanity on a scale that's unprecedented in the modern era. To me, that is the worst definition of a criminal.
Forced labor camps, torture chambers, and executions have remained a part of North Korean control since the late 1950s.
Being executed and tortured, sent to the camp, demoted to the province, and if you had power, having it taken away and punished are all considered as being purged.
Kang Chol-hwan and his family were among those swept up by purges meant to cleanse the society.
저는 이제 평양에서 태어났고요. 어릴 때 저희 부모님이
I was born in Pyongyang, and my parents were pretty high-ranking. But after they were purged, we were forced to go to this concentration camp in Hamgyeongnam-do. From when I was 9 to 19, for 10 years. It was about a 6-hour-long journey on a truck into the mountains, and we encountered a massive gate where completely armed soldiers were lined up, which reminded me of the prisons from Japanese colonial period and North Korean movies. As I entered the prison, I saw people wearing rags, looking dirty and poor. I thought the kids who were around my height must be around my age, but found out that they were 2 or 3 years older. As they didn't eat well, those older than me stopped growing and were about the same height as me. After 2 years, I was one of those kids. And the new kids that arrived were much taller than me.
제가 나중에 한 2년 있다 보니까 저도 그렇게 돼 있더라고요. 새로 들어온 애들이 저보다 키가 훨씬 크더라고요.
Some people say that Kim Il-sung could out-Stalin Stalin. He was more ruthless and brutal than Stalin. And he really purged anyone who owned property, owned land, intellectuals, technocrats, any opposition, including communist opposition as well.
Prisoners would eat excreted corn, rodents, anything to stay alive. Starvation would be accelerated by forced labor.
총살도 그게 한계가 있죠.
There are limitations to executing by firing squad. And since North Korea has a system that needs to be financially maintained, they must have thought that keeping the inmates alive to make them labor until they die would be more financially beneficial than killing them. Therefore, they need the prison camps, and by having them, they can amplify the sense of horrors to the people. So, I think they run the prison camps for two reasons. First, to maintain the regime, and second, to get financial benefits.
It's not coincidental that they have 100,000 people in horrible prison camps. I mean, this is the world's worst violators of human rights. This is the hell on earth. When we think about what's happening in this country, every day we should be thinking about these people's suffering.
Many are trafficked to other countries as slave labor, forced to send their salaries back to the regime.
We have found evidence of North Korean human trafficking. They've got thousands of workers in Eastern Europe, large-scale North Korean population in Russia, and there's no evidence that they're keeping their salaries. They're giving their money back to the state. So essentially they're slaves. I think the Japanese estimate that over 100 Japanese were abducted by the North Koreans in the 70s and 80s. Who does this? What type of government kidnapping people, abducting them, and holding them hostage or forcing them into forced labor? I mean, it's outrageous. There's really very few things around North Korea that are not outrageous. What's amazing is how good the North Koreans are at being outrageous and how much they get away with it.
Kim Kwang-jin, a defector who was in Office 39, he said, the Koreans suffer from a psychological paralysis. They know what the outside world is, but they've had 70 years of indoctrination, and it really psychologically paralyzes them. But more importantly, he says, the Koreans in the North are all liars. Now, that's a pretty strong statement, and we think of liar, as obviously a very negative term. But what he means by that is that to survive in North Korea, you've got to lie to yourself. You've got to lie to your family, because your family will turn on you. You've got to lie to your workplace, lie to your school, lie to the party. I think that is something very powerful and something very hard for us as outsiders to grasp and understand.
Kim Il-sung created the criminal state in 1948. He established a brutal dictatorship wholly unique in the world, leading a cult-like following until his death in 1994. His son, Kim Jong-il, inherited the virtual throne, a devastating famine, and a collapsed economy, constructing a system of corruption and crime to prop up his military and buy loyalty from the ruling class. In 2011, his son, Kim Jong-un, took the reins at age 28, untested and unknown by the society that looked to his family as godlike saviors. Like his father and grandfather before him, Kim Jong-un ordered the obligatory purges to legitimize his ascension. Within a few years, 5 of the pallbearers seen here escorting his father's hearse will have disappeared, been executed, or banished. Unlike his father and grandfather, he will propagate an image of a modern leader of a modern nation, to elites becoming increasingly younger and hungry for a place on the world stage.
The morning of November 24th started out as so many mornings had been. I went to the gym on the lot, got dressed, went up to my office.
I got a call from our head of publicity who said, the internet's down. I said, great. Then she said, no, it's like really down.
I heard a knock, and the person knocking was a fellow who really oversaw the information technology. He said with a degree of urgency in his voice, Sheraton, please, come look at this. On the screen of his computer was this devil-horned skeletal figure. My initial reaction was that this was some sort of prank. He said, it's not only on my computer.
I spoke to a Sony executive who tonight is giving new details of the scope of this attack, and it has been massive.
So I went to the office, and what I saw, and my office was back in the corner on the 3rd floor, were people literally just standing outside their offices, not sure what to do. The very worst of it was when this, kind of skull and crossbones came up, and basically people were told, if you didn't cooperate with us, we're going to come after you.
Sony Pictures Entertainment was under attack, and a little movie may have been the cause.
Hello, North Korea!
The comedy movie, The Interview, that Sony had produced about assassinating Kim Jong-un, which of course is the worst thing that you could do. It was an insult. And of course, one of the prime rules in North Korea is you don't insult the regime. You don't insult Kim Jong-un.
When The Interview was first being promoted, and it was being rather well received, I remember seeing a trailer in a theater and thinking that looks really funny. I also remember thinking, wow, they're actually using the North Korean ruler's name, and that's pretty gutsy. I remember shortly thereafter it became clear that the North Korean regime was taking offense at this.
Sony Pictures Hollywood offices were the most affected. By the time the malicious virus spread, 70% of their computer network would be destroyed. Then the data dumps began. Emails and sensitive personal information, thought secure and private, released for the world to see.
It's just a juggling act between balancing, all the getting the work done, you had to do at work, and then making sure in your personal life with all your information, social security number, passport, information being leaked out, that you weren't violated that way. I remember my sister sitting at her desk one day crying because, someone was trying to get her bank account. Sony wasn't hacked, people were hacked. And that was the most devastating part of it. You make a movie that's meant to be funny, that you're going to have something like this happen? I don't know who predicts that.
The film's release came at a time of great vulnerability for Kim Jong-un. In 2014, North Korea's young leader was still proving himself. Just 3 years since his father's death, he needed to cement his role as supreme leader, earn loyalty with military leadership, and buy allegiance from Pyongyang elites. Insulting the regime, even in satire, does not fit their narrative.
The essence of the North Korean government is the maintenance of the Kim family in power. The whole mythology of the government is that there is this family, it's this mythological bloodline, everything is dependent on that.
The first, I would say, 4 to 6 weeks of the hack were like a very long-lasting hurricane. There was really no escaping this story. And with the advent of social media, 24-hour news networks, everywhere you would go, if you caught a screen, there was that Sony water tower with a chyron under it saying, new fallout from Sony hack.
All of our deals were released. So deals we had with different networks were available for people to look at it. It's one part of it. People's salaries were released. So as you can imagine, people start looking at what so-and-so makes, and that caused issues.
The Sony invasion would come to symbolize a turning point in North Korea's criminal cyber capability. It sent a clear message that they could and would terrorize whenever and whomever they want.
The hardest part for me was literally like waking up every day. You know, like my alarm clock was my phone. So I get up early and I cringed, like what was going to be on that, what emails would be released today. And when your emails to your son or your wife or children or colleagues that were, you know, maybe it said stuff that wasn't so flattering to others, it'd deal with all that.
I don't believe that the Sony team was any more cavalier or loose than other executives might be. I think that's a hallmark of working at the highest levels of the entertainment industry. Sony's really no different. It's just that Sony got caught.
It was not just the first time that the United States woke up and realized that North Korea was capable enough to be able to execute an attack and operation of this scale, but it was three things put together. The cyber operation, the intimidation campaign, and the destruction that I think combined made people really realize North Korea had come so far and that we were really looking at an actual adversary, right? And not just a nuisance anymore.
They were preparing for some kind of activity for some time because they conducted phishing attacks to gain access to the Sony network. But North Korea was much more sophisticated than that. And so they were sending, spoofing emails. They thought they were from people they knew. They click on a link and that gives them access. And so they just got to get through one time.
Then North Korea posted an open letter, threatening theaters with 9/11 style terror attacks.
The fact that it was North Korea, obviously the connection to the film, the interview, was there. It seemed like a hyper overreaction to something. So I guess in hindsight, I'm not surprised that a sense of humor is something that's sorely lacking there.
From what I've been told, it was the largest attack on a U.S. corporation in history. And I remember talking to a government official, they said, it may be the first, the biggest, it won't be the last.
It has the marks of a terrorist attack. And yes, they attacked us without putting a soldier on the ground. This is, I think, the complexity of cyber is how do you respond to that? If they fired a missile, dropped a bomb, if they killed a soldier or killed a person, we might respond, everybody might expect a response in a similar way. But cyber, I think we're still figuring out how to do that.
The death of Kim Jong-il and the succession of his son, Kim Jong-un, marked a critical point in North Korea's aggressive tactics toward the outside world. It was December 2011, and journalist Jean H. Lee was tasked with opening the first Associated Press office in the capital, Pyongyang. En route to her new post, she learned of Kim Jong-il's death.
We arrived in North Korea to a country that was in mourning. I was there for the entire transition and succession period, the time when Kim Jong-un was being groomed to become the next leader, and also the time that the North Koreans were being groomed to prepare for his leadership. It's been absolutely fascinating to see a country in transition. How, when you are a country that poor, do you tell your people that this young man that none of them knew was going to take over? And so understanding how they paved the way for that to happen and what he had to do to win the people's trust and loyalty and gain legitimacy as this young man inheriting power has been very, I think, essential to understanding what's happening in North Korea today.
It was a very tense period for North Korea. You had Kim Jong-un, who was not even 30 years old when his father died in 2011. In North Korean culture, you have to be 30 years old to even be considered a man. His father, Kim Jong-il, had had 30 years in the system before Kim Il-sung died in 1994. So he had a lot of experience, developed the relationships, had the skills to run the regime.
Kim Jong-un, groomed as heir apparent, makes his debut in 2010, and the dynastic myth-making machine was put into action.
He was very much in the public eye at his father's side, paving the way for his reign. And a lot of the messaging that we were getting on the ground was he's young, he's modern, he supports science and technology, he's going to do everything his father and his grandfather did, but in a modern way. And so that kind of language and messaging was very, very clear. And it's been very consistent throughout his leadership.
There are two things you need to be able to do to be able to consolidate power in a place like North Korea. You need to develop relationships, and you need to be educated into how to manipulate the levers of power.
Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-un's grandfather, was the first leader of North Korea. He established the levers of power by conducting throughout the 1950s a reign of terror upon anyone perceived as a political threat, including torture, killings, and banishment to Stalinist labor camps. It became a family tradition.
So we started to see lots of purges going on within the regime. They were primarily of the military, to basically bring the military out of the military first policy of the Kim Jong-il era into the Kim Jong-un era, which would focus more on the economy and the party and the people.
Experts believe that over 400 were purged by Kim Jong-un.
North Korea is a police state on steroids. I mean, it makes the Stalinist police state look like a walk in the park. There is a joke that goes around Pyongyang that if you have 3 people sitting down at a table to have a drink, at least one of those people is an informant. And it's true, everybody is watching everybody. You have individuals that are watching individuals, you have institutions that are watching institutions.
As Kim's court carries out a brutal suppression, he publicly projects an image of a modern leader for a modern nation.
The younger generation, these are his peers. He's a young man in his 30s. If he wants to rule until the ripe old age of 80-something, like his grandfather or his father who reached the late 70s, he's going to need the support of this younger generation. So much of the strategy has been around how do we appeal to this younger generation? Science and technology has been a huge part of that. They could also inspire and corral their younger generation by enticing them with computers. So look, this is something where you don't have to go out into the field in the dead of winter, freezing to death. You could actually sit in a computer lab at a computer and be patriotic that way. Serve your country that way. That was the messaging that was very clear. It's still very clear in their TV dramas, in their documentaries, that they're trying to sell the image of a computer scientist as a way to serve your country, as a way to defend your country.
The majority of cyber operations that North Korea conducted up until about 2013 and 2014 were of the disruptive, destructive, chaos-causing type, right? Sony attack is one of them. After the Sony attack, there is a change, there's a shift. There's always been an underlying intention on North Korea's part to use cyber operations for traditional espionage, right? Attack governments, steal information, right? So that existed then and it still exists today. But in 2015, the bite of sanctions, right, and the isolation, specifically the financial isolation, really began to take hold. And at that time, it appears that Kim Jong-un and his leadership sort of began to realize the opportunities on the internet that they could exploit.
The Kims have never shied away from skirting decades-old and increasing economic sanctions by conducting illicit activities, bringing in much-needed hard currency. The regime took action to make cyber profitable by grooming an army of criminal computer scientists.
North Koreans are very good at research, at scoping out their potential targets, at investigating them, spending the time, the months to figure out what the computer systems look like, where the vulnerabilities are. Doing good homework is the basis for a successful cyber operation. It's a real-time, responsive operation. People are at the keyboards with their team around them, and if one exploit for vulnerability doesn't work, then they have to try another one. And so the ability to move within a network, accomplish your goal quickly and speedily as possible, and get out. So North Korea has all of these aspects, that one could say are sophisticated.
Armies of hackers sent to live abroad, many in China, begin targeting the SWIFT system, the global standard for bank-to-bank money transfers.
What they have been able to do is to use cyber for an economic gain. And this means transferring funds illicitly within banks by getting access to the SWIFT accounts, which then allows them to then manipulate money within banks. We saw this within the Bank of Bangladesh, in which they stole about $81 million. They transferred that money to the Federal Reserve Bank in New York and then forwarded it on to the Bank of Philippines. And then they were able to launder it through a variety of banking accounts and casino accounts. And so they have been very adept at being able to do this.
They successfully stole the $81 million, but it is believed that multiple spelling errors kept the hackers from getting $1 billion through the Federal Reserve.
That is a real threat to the U.S. financial system, and we really should respond to those kind of threats and activities very strongly. And in this case, we didn't. And this is always the problem with the North, is that they get away with everything, and no one ever responds because everybody's afraid of the catastrophic response from the North.
This is a revolutionary culture. This is a culture that comes out of a guerrilla movement that was established and really kind of grew up in the 1930s and 40s, fighting against Japan. A lot of things that they needed to do, were sleight of hand, and for being able to survive in the world.
Established after World War II, when the Korean Peninsula was arbitrarily divided at the 38th parallel, the Communist North was born out of the rubble left in the wake of the Korean War, which was Kim Il-sung's failed attempt to reunify one nation. The two Koreas have faced periods of both hostility and peace, but both nations eye one another with measured distrust. North Korea has an estimated 14,000 artillery pieces capable of reaching the South's capital Seoul, maintaining a constant threat.
North Korea is always looking for ways to remind the South Koreans about them. Remember, don't forget about us. Because I think that is a big concern of North Koreans. They're very concerned that their rich brothers across the border have left them behind, that they are too wrapped up in their wealth. But also they understand that their nearest neighbors, South Korea, this is a country that is perhaps one of the most digitally savvy, most dependent on technology in the world, and that they always have that as their trump card.
It is estimated that the North attempts 1.5 million cyber attacks on South Korea every day, just to disrupt routine life.
It's a staggering number, but I think that's really the essence of cyber, just like terrorism. You have to keep trying to penetrate, and of course, the problem with defending against that is you've got to be good and you got to be right 100% of the time. They just got to get through one time.
It's a way to remind South Koreans, we may be poor, but we have the ability, the capability to completely paralyze your life. And I've had this experience. I got a news alert on my phone that there had been a cyber attack that paralyzed the banking system. Your mind starts to whir. Everything could come down in a flash.
The attacks, while they were bad, they were not catastrophic. But of course, if they took down the infrastructure in the South or created a nuclear power accident, you know, one of the 23 nuclear power plants in South Korea, that would probably cause a catastrophic response. North Korea developed this infrastructure and this knowledge base, and they continue to evolve. And of course, now I think they're at a point where they can conduct cyber activities with impunity. North Korea is a poker player that has done pretty damn well with a pair of twos. It feeds into their blackmail diplomacy. They demonstrate their capabilities, and it gives them leverage. I have sometimes said the South is the ostrich kingdom, and they've got their heads buried in the sand. And I think that you know, there's a psychology that you know, we've lived with this threat for so long, we can deal with it. We don't want to upset the North.
The culture really gets validated again and again. If the world is against you and is going to prevent you from engaging in economic activity in a above-board manner, then you will figure out very sophisticated ways, illicit ways, in order to secure funding or to engage in economic practice.
When its main benefactor, the Soviet Union, fell, North Korea's economy collapsed. With that came an increased need for cash and goods to keep the military culture afloat. And most crucially, keep the elites of Pyongyang allied with the Kims. Historically, predating cyber technology, the North has conducted trade, legal and illegal, within the borders of allied nations. But its relationship with China has always been the most complex. China has been a longtime ally in the region and a historic enabler for decades.
China's not turning a blind eye to North Korean illegal behavior, including that behavior that is happening inside of China. But because China has made a strategic decision that they would rather have the North Korean regime there than not there, they are forced to accept a certain amount of illegal activity.
The nations share a porous 880-mile border and are a strategic economic partner in the region.
Chinese and North Korean officials love to talk about their relationship as close as lips and teeth. And Beijing, out of a sense of long-buried responsibility, out of a sense of, to a small degree, communist fealty, but also out of a sense of not wanting to embarrass itself and not wanting to have to pick up the pieces if or when North Korea collapses, helps keep the country alive.
I use the analogy that North Korea is a drowning swimmer out there, and China will throw out the life ring and allow them to keep their head above water, but they won't pull them in. The Chinese government, or the Chinese Communist Party more specifically, you know, they have three no's. No war on the peninsula, no regime collapse or instability, and no nuclear weapons. So China's a pretty good baseball team because they're batting .600. But really, no war and no instability are really the watchwords and the guiding principle for the Chinese communists.
So long as North Korea stays in its lane, they are welcome to do business in China. Trading offices, acting on behalf of the regime, conduct both legal and illegal business through what is called Office 39, what John Park calls North Korea Incorporated.
North Korea Incorporated is a network of elite state trading companies that does business on behalf of the regime. But they've innovated and grew and made into a very sophisticated network a structure that started around the mid-1980s. And this was a period of Chang Song-taek. This is the former uncle of the current leader, Kim Jong-un. He was the one who set up these state trading companies. He's the one who learned as some of these state trading companies initially failed, but eventually refined them and built into the structure of the regime this apparatus that is quite formidable, very useful for the evasion of sanctions, but also in just doing plain business on behalf of the regime. He was considered a rainmaker, the Midas touch in the North Korean regime. So I think it's important to view North Korea for what it is. It is a 1%, 99% phenomenon. North Korea, Inc. is really the story about the 1%. And if you zero in on the 1%, they are mobile. They're embedded in foreign countries, and particularly neighboring countries like China. The 1% is essentially an extension of the Kim family.
Uncle Jang personified the 1%. He brought in billions of dollars for the regime through business activities within China. His power base grew, which would lead to his downfall.
The relationship between Chairman Kim and his uncle, in hindsight, is one of the early crises that Chairman Kim faces. The rumor mill among the defector community is that Uncle Chang started to siphon resources away from Kim family coffers, essentially stealing from the Kim family.
The procurement and trade operations, the trust and relationship Uncle Jang established within China was the jewel in the Kim family criminal crown.
While Kim Jong-un recognized that he needed the expertise, the benefit of what Chang Song-taek had, the threat of any other power base in North Korea was too great to be tolerated.
The uncle, according to the North Korean news agency, has now been executed. He was purged, stripped of all his posts just a few days ago. The alleged crime is what it always is in the North Korean regime, disloyalty to the regime.
During his New Year's address, Chairman Kim proclaimed, "We took the resolute measure of removing the factionalist filth lurking in the party."
The message was quite clear that for those who are in North Korea Incorporated in the business of making money and procuring on behalf of the regime, you are being watched. You cannot get away with these type of crimes against the family.
We considered him to be the second most powerful figure in North Korea. So it did send a huge message to that entire community. It also triggered a series of purges. People who were connected to him, their lives were in danger.
The execution sent a chilling wave throughout the world and contradicted the impression Kim Jong-un was trying to project. The global community didn't know what else he was capable of doing.
North Korea Incorporated looks more resilient than it was before. And with the removal of Uncle Chang, we don't quite know who the exact individual is, but the management of North Korea Incorporated seems to be more effective, more efficient, more productive. And so that's the element of the resiliency of the network, I think, that Uncle Chang built, in the sense that in the end, he turned out to be replaceable.
It was shortly after Uncle John's execution that Sony Pictures Entertainment computers were attacked. Within weeks, the North Koreans made public scripts, unreleased films, and contracts with big-name stars.
Eventually, it was all dumped on WikiLeaks. And when it became searchable information, I was like, oh, great, you know. Just when you thought it was over.
It was sort of being the center of a circular firing squad. The entire scenario made it very clear that Sony was out hanging at the end of a branch alone.
The dirty laundry of Hollywood's most bankable stars was laid out for all to see.
These stories were being perpetrated and amplified by other big entertainment media conglomerates. But it was somebody who understood where were the low-hanging fruit in terms of the names that would resonate, that would give this story more legs, that would go viral.
The most annoying to me is there were a few people who were saying like, oh, the studio's paralyzed. but the work was getting done. Movies were being made, TV shows were being produced. I mean, the world was continuing to move just because we figured out a way to get around it. I mean, there was a community that came out of this which really forged a very strong bond.
Because of the nature of the Hollywood connection and the celebrity angle, it quickly became a gossipy story about Hollywood power brokers. And here's the way they behave when they think no one's watching. And I worry that that gave cover to Washington, to holding the North Koreans responsible for this.
I don't think it was an act of war. I think it was an act of cyber vandalism that was very costly, very expensive.
The days of thinking that you have your information safe are over. And I remember talking to a government official at this conference once, and he said there were two types of people in the world. Those who have been hacked and those who don't know they're being hacked. Once that happens, you're kind of scarred. And you've got PTSD on that. So it's like, from that moment forward, everything changes.
Sony employees still deal with fallout of the 2014 North Korean cyber invasion. It was a pivotal point in their lives. It also was a pivotal point in the North's long history of criminal enterprise.
They're very crafty at doing this sort of stuff because they have at least, 40, if not 40 plus years of honing their skills at this. And they keep adding on, such as with the cyber capability. And also now that we have cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin and things like that, these are new markets for them to get involved in that are basically the Wild West of financing out there. And the North Koreans can hide a lot of their illicit activities in these things because they are not monitored like the banking system is. And it can allow them to continue to evade the game of whack-a-mole.
From the very beginning, Kim Jong-un was always characterizing himself as a savvy military strategist who uses computers as part of that strategy. We should look at that as a clue for how they're going to use and how they do use computers and computer technology as a form of asymmetrical warfare.
Asymmetric warfare is essentially balancing your weakness as a country against other countries' strengths. For North Korea, the ballistic missile program is one example. And the same thing goes with cyber operation. It's a relatively low cost, right? Low threshold, high impact strategy. That's sort of the essence of asymmetric strategy and asymmetric warfare.
Their cyber operation, like all Kim's demands, are performed with lockstep precision.
Although there are a variety of organizations that have cyber capability within North Korea, the one that really seems to be most engaged in the economic element is the Reconnaissance General Bureau.
The Reconnaissance General Bureau, RGB, is a unique intelligence organization.
The RGB is really an intelligence and special operations organization. It is spies, it is people that conduct special operations, subversion, sabotage, and from that, they have developed within that their cyber capabilities.
The RGB is one of the reasons that North Korea has remained a pariah on the world stage.
And one of the amazing things that the North Koreans have been able to do, and one of the real ways they've been able to punch above their weight, is to make people think that they matter. I mean, really, North Korea should be Laos with nuclear weapons. But instead, it's something that we're doing a show on, and it gets so much, just an unbelievable amount of attention. And that's, I feel bad saying this, but you got to give them credit for that. I mean, they have done an excellent job of remaining relevant in Washington all these decades.
Kim Jong-un began the expansion of organized hacking troops outside his borders.
They are groomed to be able to conduct cyber activities for the military or for the Reconnaissance General Bureau. It's just like Whether you're an athlete, the communist countries who will identify children for the Olympics, and groom them their entire career, they do that for cyber, for nuclear, and for the military to support the regime.
North Korea has a very distinct operational model. Most United States hackers live in the United States and work in the United States. Same with China. In North Korea, the majority of their hackers are sent abroad. Right? It's a risky operational model because in many cases, the countries that host the hackers don't realize that they're hosting them. They may not know these people are North Koreans. They certainly, in most cases, don't realize that these people are here to conduct criminal activities, right, or attacks on other countries from their soil. It's an operational model that they had to adopt because for a long time, North Korea only had one pathway to the internet, one cable that connected the entire country to the rest of the global internet.
The persistence and creativity of the North Korean cyber crooks played out when they posed as potential employers using LinkedIn to find prospective employees from the Chilean banking system.
People from the North would make contact with them, actually have Skype interviews with them, and then they would send them an email with an application to fill out for employment in this new company. And so the employee would open the file and download the application and proceed to fill it out. And they would do this on their business computer, on their workstation, which of course had malware. It was an executable file, and that would penetrate the Chilean servers and allowed North Korea access to steal money.
Ultimately, they funneled $10 million out of Chile's second largest bank to accounts in Hong Kong. It could take threat specialists years to trace a cyber attack, and even then, the money is difficult to follow.
People have numbers about how much money is generated from the suite of North Korean cyber operations, but they're inevitably wrong. We only know what operations we catch, right? So that's first. We catch maybe 50%, I think, if we're lucky. Most banks don't want to admit they've been victimized by North Korea. They don't ever disclose how much money was stolen. The second set of unknowns comes from that physical virtual network, where North Korea, it takes money to bribe people and to move money into shady and criminal places through organizations, through casinos, right, so that it becomes untraceable.
The UN estimates that the North has generated $2 billion from banks and cryptocurrency exchanges that was directed into their weapons of mass destruction campaign.
They can conduct all the cyber operations they want and have digital currency and money in virtual bank accounts, right, in the SWIFT system, in the Philippines Bank. But at some point, North Korea needs to move that money from the virtual world to the physical to buy the actual goods they need, right? The coal and the supplies for the missiles and the army and the rice for the people. And that's the point that we have the sort of least amount of knowledge, right? Where is the money from these operations going, right? And where can we interdict it?
One attack that tracked North Korea was on the ATM system of India's Cosmos Bank.
The Cosmos attack was the first time that North Korea had used the ATM network and the systems that validate the transactions. They upped the amount of money that each account that they wanted to exploit could withdraw from an ATM without really the system realizing that. And then they sent out people with fraudulent cards linked to all of those accounts to go to the ATMs and withdraw that maximum amount of money and then take it somewhere.
The Cosmos Bank hackers siphoned off $13.5 million across 28 countries over one weekend. Nearly 15,000 transactions in just over 2 hours with fraudulent customer information. Then, in May of 2017, a ransomware attack spread throughout the globe, 150 nations in all. WannaCry 2.0 is now synonymous with one of the world's most notorious cyber attacks.
For WannaCry, a ransom note would have flashed on your screen. It would say something along the lines of, your files have been encrypted. we can decrypt them for you, but you need to pay X number of Bitcoin in this wallet, and we will confirm.
Windows-based computers in the U.S. and across the globe could be at risk in what some experts have called a cyber apocalypse.
WannaCry was among a stockpile of cyber weapons stolen from the U.S. National Security Agency, released by a group of hackers known as the Shadow Brokers. It crippled Britain's National Health Service, FedEx, Germany's National Railway, and countless more across the globe.
One of the reasons why WannaCry, though, was so much more prolific than typical ransomware is that the North Koreans built in or engineered this new version to include an exploit. And this particular exploit, right, allowed this piece of malware to propagate automatically, right, because it scanned computer networks looking for specific services. And if the network had that, it would then infect that network and that computer. And so it self-propagated, and that's what made it so disruptive and so difficult at first to shut off.
Marcus Hutchins, a British cybersecurity specialist, discovered a kill switch embedded in the malware, stopping the spread after days of global panic.
Cyber is proven to be a very practical tool on many levels because Kim Jong-un can use cyber, as he's done, to steal money, steal Bitcoin. He can use it to attack infrastructure. He can use it to extort money, using malware and holding companies at risk. He can use it for espionage, and he can use it for influence. So cyber is a very, very important tool. And I think Kim Jong-un has recognized this.
Cyber threat is a constant part of the world we live in. Individuals, infrastructure, corporations, and governments are not immune. In 2014, it was Sony. 2 years later, the US elections were allegedly manipulated by a disinformation campaign by Russian cybercriminals. In 2020, bad actors like North Korea continue to pay little for cyber theft, destruction, or extortion. According to an FBI indictment, North Korean hacker Park Jin-yak, known to operate out of Dalian, China, masterminded the WannaCry attack and the Sony invasion. An arrest is highly unlikely.
I think the fact that we're talking about it now 5 years later is a good thing to remind people that this is a real and present danger.
So I think they are behaving like criminals because that is their strategy for survival and keeping the Kim family in power.
They do have a potential to wreak a lot of havoc on the international financial community. You wouldn't know where the attacks are coming from. I think they have some things in their back pocket that they can unleash, and I think we know that, or suspect that they do.
He's trying to convey the image to his people and to the outside world that he's very normal, but he is not. And the kind of deception that they are engaging in is dangerous if we buy it.
For 1 week in late August 2018, families from North and South Korea were reunited. Some for the first time since the Korean War ceasefire in 1953. There have been just 20 such rounds of visits. It's a sign of diplomatic goodwill when relations between the North and South warm. Three months earlier was the historic first meeting of a U.S. sitting president and a North Korean leader. Each man agreeing to conduct a path to peace. But diplomatic efforts with North Korea by world powers have begun and stalled for decades. Will the U.S. and the two Koreas ever get it right? This is the story of the Korean Peninsula and finding a permanent peace, told by people who tried.
People love to compare diplomacy to chess because it seems so very rational and people really taking their time. There's basically two people sitting in a room thinking their moves out. I think diplomacy is more like billiards, where there are a bunch of balls in the middle of the table and somebody comes up with a cue stick and hits a ball in order to get it into a pocket on the other side. And along the way, the ball hits others, and it's horizontal and dynamic. And so with North Korea, what are the other effects? So one is obviously the relationship with China, Japan, and South Korea. I mean, it could affect many kind of in concentric circles reaching out. Plus, North Korea and the United States may not be the only people with a cue stick. So I think that it has all kinds of possibilities in terms of unintended consequences like billiards.
Why does North Korea continue to perplex and agitate the U.S. and our allies? It begins in 1948 with Kim Il-sung, a young revolutionary who will forge one of the most unique and isolated dictatorships on Earth. After World War II, two nations are arbitrarily born, divided at the 38th parallel, the Soviet-backed North and the US-backed South.
It's true that Kim Il-sung, he was a fighter. That's what he spent 10 years in Manchuria doing. And when he comes back to North Korea, he is fundamentally a revolutionary nationalist and not a communist. Ever since the army was formed in 1948, it's been the most powerful base of the Kim family's power, and it just dominates every aspect of North Korean society.
Kim will use the military to maintain a totalitarian grip on power. In June of 1950, in a bid to unify the peninsula, Kim's army invades the South. His army captures Seoul in 3 days. Fearing a communist takeover, US-led UN forces enter the Korean War. It will be a deadly affair on both sides.
There was no regard for civilian life. In North Korea, there were 8 or 9 million people at the start of the war, and they lost at least 2 million people. And about 70% of them were civilians.
After 3 years, the fighting ends. But the war shapes the North's political narrative.
It resulted in a universal hatred of the United States across North Korean society.
North Koreans believe a completely different view of what started the war and a completely different view of how it ended, in which Kim Il-sung led his troops to victory and vanquished the Americans and the South Koreans.
I always ask the North Korean officials, how is it that if the U.S. started it, that it was the North that reached Seoul within 3 days? And they've rarely encountered a heretic like myself, and so they really, their eyes kind of go wide at some of these questions. I think often they don't realize that there are these incongruous bits of information that don't really fit into their worldview.
For North Koreans, the Korean War is all about an American power that is constantly out to seek to crush them.
North Korea, much more than South Korea, is the inheritor of Korean political culture. They always kept foreigners at arm's length. It's not isolationism so much as exclusionism.
Out of this exclusionism, Kim developed a philosophy called Juche, that North Koreans need no outside influence or reliance. To a people that over centuries were occupied and invaded by imperial forces, Juche is a bold statement that resonates and rallies North Koreans behind Kim more than ever.
The leader is kind of this deity. We tend to think of North Korea as this geographical place, but in many ways it's ideology or maybe more of a religion.
With unparalleled belief in Kim Il-sung, the war-torn North Korea rebuilt and flourished in post-war modernity.
North Korea has been an urban industrial society for a long time. The Japanese had begun industrialization there in the late 1930s with steel mills and iron factories, chemical plants.
If you go back and you read the now declassified intelligence estimates, at the end of the Korean War, they basically tell the story that the North will emerge as the great prosperous country, and the South will end up as a ward of the United States for a century.
They did come out of the Korean War and for the next 20 years sort of roar ahead with intensive industrialization supported by Stalin and growing at double-digit rates.
The economic boom funded a military state. Kim was building what will eventually be the fourth largest army in the world. A low-intensity war resumed between the North and South in the 1960s and 70s. Numerous incidents, assassination attempts, skirmishes along the border, heated political tensions.
And in the midst of this, Kim Il-sung seizes the Pueblo, which was an American spy ship.
I hope that the North Koreans will recognize the gravity of the situation which they have created.
They took the crew, marched them through the port of Wonsan with their hands over their heads. That was a cover of Newsweek right after this happened.
We are very shortly today taking the question before the Security Council of the United Nations.
Kim Il-sung kept the crew for 11 months and finally let them go when the U.S. apologized in one of the great choreographed North Korean-American negotiations, where the North Koreans said, the U.S. has apologized, and the U.S. said, we don't apologize, we just told them we apologized.
We could not apologize for actions which we did not believe took place. I will sign the document to free the crew and only to free the crew.
That's how the crew finally came home.
The next year, in 1969, less than 3 months into his presidency, Richard Nixon is tested.
In power for just 88 days, the president now faces a most serious crisis in the shooting down of an American naval reconnaissance plane with 31 aboard over the Sea of Japan by 2 North Korean MiGs.
This attack was unprovoked, it was deliberate, it was without warning.
North Korea has threatened military action against South Korea and against our forces in South Korea.
They will be protected. This is not a threat, it is simply a statement of fact.
There would be no retaliation. Kim's control of the society was now firmly secured through brutality and carefully scripted propaganda.
I think it's hard to conceive of a country where the propaganda is so ubiquitous and where brainwashing has worked so well and where the controls are just so extreme.
In the 1980s, South Korea began to outpace the North's economy and was firmly allied with the U.S. The North orders a series of attacks on the South that lands them on the state sponsors of terrorism list. And the North's benefactor, the Soviet Union, begins to founder. Unable to support a modern society, the North built a nuclear reactor with help from the Soviets at the Yongbyon Nuclear Scientific Research Center. They claimed it was intended to produce electricity, and in 1985, they signed on to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But that claim will prove false.
The North Koreans had been subsidized and helped by the Soviet Union. And then when the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, the Russians took less and less of an interest in what was going on in North Korea.
Basically, the economy collapsed, but the regime didn't collapse because these people know how to hold on to power.
Soon, the Yongbyon reactor looked like a moneymaker.
I don't think Kim Il-sung really believed that nuclear weapons were going to be a salvation for North Korea. I think he thought they were useful as a bargaining chip with the U.S., which is exactly what he used them for.
In March 1993, the North threatened to pull out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Then President Bill Clinton was tested.
We were trying to figure out what we were going to do about the North Koreans pulling out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Ambassador Albright will be beginning her discussions today at the United Nations about a sanctions resolution which we propose, which would include phased sanctions designed to deal not only with the actions of the North Koreans to date, but as a deterrent to future destructive conduct.
North Korea threatened to pull out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They ultimately did. Probably the closest moment that the United States and South Korea came to resuming a conflict with the North, we plunged into what became the 1994 nuclear crisis.
In May of 1994, they took 8,000 fuel rods out of Yongbyon plutonium reactor. That was enough for multiple nuclear weapons.
This is indeed the gravest issue with which the Council is dealing.
Then, an unexpected surprise catches the administration off guard.
All of a sudden, somebody comes in and says, President Carter's on the television.
Jimmy Carter flew all the way to Pyongyang to meet with Kim Il-sung.
It was a surprise to us.
I think he will reaffirm our position. What I'm more hopeful of is that he will get a better sense from them about where they are, and that they will understand that we're very firm in our position.
I think it's perfectly possible it led the North Koreans to take some action.
Carter got a commitment to a freeze.
It wasn't that we disagreed or disapproved of what he was doing. It was just such a surprise that a former president would have gone off and done something like that.
If today's developments mean that North Korea is genuinely and verifiably prepared to freeze its nuclear program while talks go on, and we hope that is the case, then we would be willing to resume high-level talks.
I personally believe that the crisis is over, and I personally believe that Kim Il-sung wants to be sure that the crisis is over. The next step, obviously, is to make sure that the agreements that were worked out between me and him are carried out.
There is an alternative path, and a very good one for North Korea, that they don't have to become more isolated. They could become more engaged in the world in ways that would be much better for their own people.
Just weeks after Carter leaves Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung dies of a heart attack on July 9th, 1994. The nation loses their supreme leader, their father, their God. His son, Kim Jong-il, took power in the world's first communist dynastic handover. The people have a new deity, a new father, a dear leader. After months of negotiations, the Clinton administration and North Korea signed the agreed framework, meaning regular inspections and a freeze to nuclear weapon production.
This agreed framework was a deal that they would be back in the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
We got a commitment to a nuclear freeze, which kept all their plutonium fuel, the 8,000 fuel rods, under UN inspection night and day for the next 8 years.
As part of this agreement, the United States was supplying the North Koreans with heavy fuel oil, and the United States, South Korea, and Japan agreed to build 2 light water reactors in North Korea, specifically designed to produce electricity.
At this point, it was an accomplishment, no question about it.
Then in 1998, another provocation from Kim Jong-il. The testing of an intermediate-range ballistic missile.
President Clinton felt that it was very important for us to have a full review of everything to do with North Korea. So he asked former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry to do a review of everything that was going on, trying to figure out what the North Koreans were up to.
Perry did a great deal in the next 2 years to engage North Korea and to transform American policy toward North Korea.
reactor. They would have completed the 200 megawatt reactor.
Perry said, I believe, in September 1998, we have to deal with North Korea not as we would like it to be, but as it is. When I heard that, I thought, aha, a ray of realism in the Korean situation.
He went to Pyongyang to talk to the North Koreans. He said to them, it's fork in the road time. We either can negotiate about what's going on in terms of your missile production, or we actually will be forced to use force and try to figure it out.
Secretary Albright.
And so what happened was the North Koreans said, let's negotiate.
If North Korea will forego long-range missiles as well as nuclear weapons, then we should be prepared, we the Allies, should be prepared to move step by step in a reciprocal fashion to normalization. Normalization of political relations, normalization of economic relations.
The United States is suspending restrictions on certain categories of non-military trade, financial transactions, travel, and diplomatic contacts with North Korea.
The number 2 guy, Vice Marshal Cho, came to my office as Secretary of State. He was dressed in a 3-piece pinstripe suit, very much a diplomat.
They worked out a deal saying neither country will have hostile relations with the other.
We ultimately did sign it. It was called the Albright-Cho Agreement. Later in the day, he changed into his uniform, and we went to the Oval Office. And he had a uniform with lots of medals and things, including one for fighting Americans during the Korean War.
They worked out a deal for an indirect buyout of North Korea's medium and long-range missiles.
So we're in the Oval, and he gives the president a folder in which was an invitation for President Clinton to go to North Korea. President Clinton said at some point maybe I would go, but this needs to be prepared, so I'm sending the Secretary of State. They weren't real thrilled about that at the beginning because they really wanted to have President Clinton there.
This first ever high-level visit from Pyongyang is another remarkable development in what has been a remarkable period.
Obviously, I'm going to go, but it was very difficult to figure out exactly what was going to happen because we had no embassy in Pyongyang.
Diplomacy is human beings talking to each other and reaching an agreement, showing respect for culture, letting the other side save face.
It is astonishing how skilled the North Korean civil service is. They are very subtle thinkers. They are deeply knowledgeable about everything going on in the U.S. These are really first-rate diplomats.
If we're not prepared, we don't have our act together, we put up unrealistic expectations, they're going to outsmart us.
First thing you do is you figure out who you're talking to and you figure out what they've said in the past.
I spent as much time as I possibly could learning about North Korea from the people that were the experts. Before I went, I talked to Kim Dae-jung, the new president of South Korea. He himself had gone to Pyongyang to meet with Kim Jong-il. He said, you're going to find he is not crazy. He knows what he's talking about. We wanted them to stop threatening with their ballistic missiles, and we wanted to make sure that they understood that they had obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty as well as under the agreed framework, and that they were not to develop nuclear weapons.
Kim Jong-il wanted cash, fuel, nuclear power generators. He wanted money.
They were hungry, and they also needed fuel, and we certainly didn't want them taking fuel rods out and beginning to extract plutonium from them.
2 weeks after the meeting with Vice Marshal Cho, Secretary Albright arrives in Pyongyang.
So we get there, and there's the normal kind of police escort clearing people from the streets. There was nobody on the streets. There were some people walking and a couple on bicycles, but they never looked at this motorcade, as if they saw motorcades all the time.
I've been to North Korea 8 times, and there's always a pattern You arrive at the airport.
How are you, my friend?
They hand you your schedule. You don't tell them who you want to see. They tell you who they want you to see.
I was told that I had to go and pay my respects to the father of the country if I was going to get anywhere in any meeting. But if you bow too low, then you're criticized by the American press for being obsequious. And if you don't bow low enough, you haven't accomplished what you need to. So I must have been at the right angle, because they said, now the dear leader will see you. And then I was standing next to him, and I saw that I was the same height as he was. And I knew that I had on high heels, and then I looked over and he did too. And his hair was a lot poofier than mine. We then did go to the meeting. He was not a stupid man. He really didn't turn to his experts in terms of technical things about the missiles and all that. So he did know an awful lot in terms of issues to do with missile limits. He didn't mince words about the fact that they had capabilities, but that they needed a missile in order to launch satellites. And then also that they did need currency.
The North Koreans don't negotiate like we do. They don't think like we do. They don't believe in quid pro quos.
You can't deal with everything in any negotiation. You build this one step at a time. The main problem are the nuclear weapons, and then you deal with the ballistic missiles and various other behavior.
You don't make a deal with them, I have found, unless there's an informal setting, like walking outside of a building, or a dinner, or smoking a cigar. You never cut a deal when you're negotiating formally.
All of a sudden he says to me, well, I have a surprise for you tonight. And I thought, I wonder what that is. We went to this huge arena. I was told there were like 200,000 people there. And then all of a sudden this incredible program began with most colorful costumes and gymnastics and people dancing in rows. And they had a flip card section. They were good enough at these flip cards that they could make the missile go up. Kim Jong-il, through an interpreter, said to me, that's the last one. My whole impression about everything was that it was quite professional, very well received by their own population, who were trained to clap in unison. As we left, the press said, so what did you think of it? And I said, it was very impressive. And then I kind of added later, only a dictator can make 100,000 people dance in step. So then we go to dinner. There was French wine and a lot of food. It was very interesting because there were lots of lights in the stadium. There were lots of lights, obviously, at this particular dinner. But then when you're out on the streets of Pyongyang, there was nothing.
The next day, as talks resume, the secretary brings up human rights.
I asked him about the condition of the population, and he knew that he had to do something different for his people. He didn't express great sorrow over his people or sympathy, but that they did need something different. The atmosphere was very good, frankly. I think the part that was really interesting was his desire to have some kind of a different relationship. And at that stage, he even indicated that we could keep our forces in South Korea. And so I felt that we had had very productive talks.
We have a moratorium on testing of all long-range missiles, and we obviously are continuing these very serious missile discussions. And I take what he said on these issues as serious in terms of his desire and ours to move forward.
Kim Jong-il said if Bill Clinton comes to Pyongyang next month, December, I will sign this deal, which limits missiles to 300 kilometers or 180 miles, which would have solved the missile problem at the same time that Clinton had solved The plutonium problem.
When we left office, the North Koreans did not have any more fissile material, they did not have ICBMs, and they did not have nuclear weapons.
That was a really good thing. There were international monitors in North Korea to make sure that their program wasn't operating.
For 9 years, North Korea did not produce a nuclear weapon.
But then we had the election that lasted 5 or 6 weeks. The Supreme Court, 5-4, decided George Bush was the president.
Foreign policy doesn't come in 4-year segments.
We change our teams as our new administrations come in. They keep the same team.
We are a democracy, and we the people change our government on a regular basis every 4 and 8 years. We're also a very noisy democracy. We shout and scream and argue with each other. It's wonderful. It's called democracy. They don't. They have a state organization that has been consistent with respect to its policies for the last 70 years, since they were created in 1948.
They had deep familiarity with the history of U.S.-North Korean relations, whereas American officials bouncing in and out tended to be much less knowledgeable.
The U.S., as a matter of policy during the Clinton years, was waiting for North Korea to collapse. The CIA director said that to Congress in 1995. It's no longer a question of whether North Korea would collapse, but when. The North Korean commander of their army shot back within 48 hours. It's no longer a case of whether there'll be another Korean War, but only when. Which is a very important exchange because it validates what I've always believed, and that is the North Koreans will go down fighting if they think they're going down.
We were somewhat behind in terms of the fuel deliveries. And so the North Koreans felt that it was possible for them to begin developing ballistic missiles.
North Korea has lied to us, has cheated us. We indeed have likewise not fulfilled some of our obligations.
Agreements are cheated on, which is why you have verification processes. I did talk with Colin Powell, and I described in great length to him where we were, and Colin was very interested in it.
And I got a very good briefing. I understood what they were trying to do, and I have some background with North Korea, having commanded a battalion on the demilitarized zone many years ago. And so we took it all aboard, and so I was ready to sort of see if I could build on that. A little problem emerged, and that shortly after I became Secretary of State, I was hosting a group of European leaders out of the EU, and one of them asked me about it, and I said, well, we're going to see how we can build on what has been done. That was translated in the Washington Post the next day as Powell buys into Clinton policies, which caused me a big problem because the president had not agreed to that, and in fact, nobody really wanted to follow up on anything that Clinton had done.
They thought Clinton was appeasing the North Koreans, that these agreements were unverifiable.
As we look at the elements of the negotiation that the previous administration had left behind, there are some things there that are very promising. What was not there was a monitoring and verification regime of the kind that we would have to have in order to move forward in negotiations with such a regime.
You nailed down what you can nail down. We had the plutonium nailed down. We thought we had the missiles nailed down. Maybe we couldn't verify every last one of them, but they weren't going to be testing.
North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
I really regretted the fact that we were not able to persuade the Bush people to go on.
American pundits on the left and the right just love to say North Korea never kept an agreement. But they kept it for 8 years, and in my view, the Bush administration was the primary actor in destroying that freeze.
The president and his associates claim that we'll do a year-long study of this, but there really wasn't a study. And so after a year, I went back to the president and said, look, I'm going to a meeting in Asia with all of the Asian nations there, and the North Koreans will be there. And we just can't let this sit. So with your permission, I'm going to reach out to the North Koreans. And he said, okay. So we sat down, and what I made clear to them was that President Bush is anxious to help the North Korean people. He knows that you have economic problems, you have food problems, you have other problems, and he wants to help. His motivation is one of humanitarian concern, not going to war with North Korea. But what we really have to talk about are some of the issues that are holding us back, i.e. your nuclear weapons program. And that was the beginning of a process. And then as the process started to develop, it occurred to me that rather than just making this North Korea, South Korea, and us, let's get the others in the region who have as much interest in North Korean nuclear programs as we do.
I could see from the South Koreans that they were very concerned that the U.S. was non-engaged. And so you could see opinion surveys in South Korea showing that somehow people were beginning to blame the United States for North Korea's nuclear ambitions.
When you have a South Korean president who's very interested in engaging the North, it brings pressure on the U.S. to engage the North, which we have never wanted to do, really.
Finally, the president sat down with the Chinese leader. The two of them agreed the U.S. couldn't do this alone. We needed other countries in the region to be engaged in it.
Both sides will continue to work toward a nuclear weapons-free Korean peninsula and a peaceful resolution of this issue.
Shortly thereafter, China stepped in with three-party talks, China, the U.S., and North Korea, to try to get diplomacy moving. And they also stage-managed what became the six-party talks, always held in Beijing, with China sort of chaperoning diplomats from Russia, Japan, the two Koreas, China, and the U.S.
The North Korean situation is one that can be resolved peacefully through diplomacy.
And as we were working on this and showing some progress, bam, we discovered that they had another program that we knew nothing about, the uranium enrichment program.
The North Koreans were continuing to make purchases of equipment and technology, which was consistent with the idea they might have had another way to a bomb with enriched uranium. The Bush administration basically said, look, we're not going to deal with these guys. And for some 3, almost 4 years, they didn't. You had a lot of people in the States who felt that any kind of contact with the North Koreans was, in and of itself, a bad idea.
John Bolton, in particular, who was out to get rid of the North Korean regime.
The DPRK must open up to inspection and show that it is committed to a nuclear-free peninsula. That is what the agreed framework was intended to achieve. If the DPRK fails to do so promptly, the future of the agreed framework will be in serious doubt.
So instead of going to the North Koreans and saying, this is not acceptable, the Bush administration basically said the North can't be trusted, and the whole agreement unraveled.
On the subject of DPRK, North Korea, and its announcement today that it intends to withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the United States condemns this action on the part of North Korea and also finds it very, very unfortunate.
During that period where there were no negotiations, the North Koreans merrily started producing more plutonium and actually made a lot of progress on their nuclear program.
Even with Russia, China, South Korea, and Japan in agreement, the six-party talks struggle to make progress.
It generally takes a long time to get diplomacy going, and in fact, through the first 6 months of 2005, we didn't have much traction at all, and the North Koreans had not come back to this new system of six-party talks. They regarded it as kind of ganging up on them 5-1.
Unfortunately, we don't yet have any signs that the DPRK attaches the same amount of importance to this process that China does and that we do and that ROK does and that Japan does and that the Russian Federation does.
Diplomacy is traditional. It's dialogue. It's cooperation. Find common ground.
Anyone who's ever been involved in diplomatic negotiations or family negotiations, it's kind of hard to do when you have 6 participants. In the case of the six-party talks, we had 5 different languages. And so the way that was done is you had this enormous 6-sided table, and then you had these huge white plastic tulips. As you began to speak, all the tulips would light up, meaning the interpreters were busy interpreting what you were saying in the other languages. So if you said, "Good morning, it's great to be here," you would look at the tulips in the center and make sure that each interpreter had finished, and you would know because the LED light had turned off. And then you would begin your second sentence. They'd all light up again. Needless to say, this is no way to talk to anybody. So we quickly determined that we would sometimes have a full plenary session in the morning with all 125 people, but we would quickly break up into bilateral, trilateral, quadrilateral talks. We had to have a situation where we were talking one-on-one, and that was the way the six-party process proceeded.
The six-party talks, which went on for a few years, looked like a good venue for having these kinds of forums in Northeast Asian diplomacy.
It was pretty apparent to me from the first moment I met with the North Koreans that Kim Jong-il was following everything. So much so that when I was talking to my counterpart, Kim Gae-kwan, and I looked over to see what the note-taker was up to, I have never seen a note-taker work so hard in my life. So I figured that that note-taker was probably the person to talk to more than the head of the North Korean delegation.
I met Kim Jong-il very fleetingly once. He did not negotiate. He had his foreign ministry and his military people negotiate.
We finally had an agreement, but then a funny thing happened, which was that the U.S. announced new economic sanctions against North Korea.
Kim Jong-il might well have been completely put off by the Bush administration turning hostile.
We had a hiatus for about 18 months, during which the North Koreans refused to go to talks, and during which they also exploded their first nuclear device and fired off a few missiles, choosing July 4th, 2006 as the day to do that.
We overestimated how much time it would take for the country to build up a missile capability that could reach the continental United States, and how quickly they could build up a good-sized nuclear arsenal.
And then finally we got back together in about February 2007, and we were able to make progress implementing the agreement.
Kim agrees to shut down and seal the Yongbyon reactor and allow inspectors into the country.
Let me begin with a statement by the President. I am pleased with the agreements reached today at the six-party talks in Beijing. These talks represent the best opportunity to use diplomacy to address North Korea's nuclear programs. They reflect the common commitment of the participants to a Korean peninsula that is free of nuclear weapons.
Hi, how are you?
When we went out to the reactor, you looked at this nuclear plant and you think to yourself, that thing is producing nuclear weapons?
That agreement led to the North Koreans blowing up the cooling towers at the Yongbyon plutonium facility in front of a lot of foreign reporters as an indication that they were going to go forward with an agreement with the U.S.
The disabling of these facilities is a sign that the North Koreans may in fact be ready to make a strategic choice.
I think that there are a lot of bumps on the road to implementation of this, and I'm sure the North Koreans will try and play it to their advantage, and that may be an opportunity to showing their bad faith, which I expect to be demonstrated quite shortly.
We did get them to shut down the reactor. We got them to do a number of things, but finally we were not able to complete the job because they would not allow us to verify things that we needed. And you know, there's no trust me in this game. It's all about verification.
Show us everything you've got. Until we know everything you've got, there can be no serious discussions. Tell us everything you've got, no more surprises. And let's see if we can get a deal out of this. And a deal that secures your sovereignty and your independence.
Obama initially also tried to do something with the North Koreans, but then he went into this strategic patience.
President Obama was the first president who said, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm not going into some long negotiation in order to go reach an agreement that we reached 10 or 15 years ago and pay the North Koreans again to do something that they agreed to do 10 or 15 years ago.
You know, that was probably a mistake too.
I don't like doing nothing. I think, you know, the six-party framework, it didn't break through but I think it's always useful to talk to the other side of an argument. That's what diplomacy is all about. And sooner or later, maybe you can find the beginning of a solution.
In December 2011, the dear leader Kim Jong-il died unexpectedly, and his son Kim Jong-un was catapulted to deity status. Unlike his father, little is known, other than he was approximately 28 years old, untested, and perhaps not ready to lead a nation of such political and military complexity. He's rumored to be unpredictable and displays eccentricities like his friendship with NBA star Dennis Rodman. But Kim Jong-un proves to be savvy, shoring up his alliances by a brutal purge of the inner circle, including his uncle, publicly executed for crimes against the state, and accelerates the nuclear program, again in a bid to get American attention, in another provoke and get paid strategy.
It's the only thing of value that they have that we would engage in a conversation about and perhaps give them something for it.
In the fall of 2016, when President Obama first met with then-President-elect Trump, he said that the most urgent problem will likely be North Korea.
In 2017, North Korea undertook a charm offensive, and that enabled me to get another visa and return to North Korea and interview foreign ministry officials. But this time the mood was much bleaker. This was the aftermath of death of Otto Warmbier, the University of Virginia student. And there was much more propaganda in the Capitol. There were posters showing missiles striking the US Capitol. The tone of people was that war is probably going to come, and it's too bad, but this is probably inevitable.
Antagonistic rhetoric fired back and forth between the two leaders.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen.
And then Mr. Trump comes in, and he takes a very hardcore view of the North Koreans, as I think he should. And the president saying things like, my button is bigger than his button, fire and fury. And frankly, the country went a little wacky about all of this. Are we going to war with North Korea? Give me one strategic reason why the North Koreans would suddenly wake up one day and think it's a good idea to drop a nuclear weapon on Waikiki or in San Francisco. It's tragic to think it might happen, but give me a strategic reason why they would do it, with a certain knowledge that they'd be committing assisted suicide.
The big strategic game for President Trump is, can you convince the Chinese that they're actually more at risk with the status quo than they would be if the regime went away? So far, no American president's been able to convince a Chinese leader of that.
China has the ignition key on the North Korean car, and they would never let them start a war in Northeast Asia. For what reason? What would China gain out of it? Nothing.
As the two nations come to terms, the Trump administration, some say, rushes to a summit with the two leaders.
Then suddenly we have this Singapore meeting where, wow, all is good. And we are where we are now, where all is not good, because they still are producing nuclear material and maybe nuclear weapons. I really don't know that we know.
Since the Kim-Trump summit in June 2018, little has been accomplished with regard to the question of North Korea's nuclear program. Talks, as so often in the past, have stalled for the time being between the U.S. and the North. However, the South and North continue talks, strengthening relationships.
We have enormous interests with Russia with its thousands of nuclear warheads. Japan is a huge trading partner of the U.S. We have enormous interests with the 1.4 billion Chinese. So all of these other countries were extremely important to us, far more important than North Korea will ever be to us. But North Korea does have nuclear weapons, and so the issue absolutely needs to be addressed.
As the North celebrates its 70th anniversary, It also celebrates the Kims, its self-reliance, and its military strength.
Diplomacy is using conferences, using consultations, using a respect for the other person's opinion, whether you agree with it or not. It's trying to get along with people. It's trying to avoid wars. I've been known as a reluctant general. I am a reluctant general. I don't like war. Been in wars. It never quite turns out the way you thought it was going to turn out. So let's try to avoid wars. And let's try diplomacy. Let's try UN resolutions. Let's give the other side a way to get out.
North Korea remains an enigma, seemingly wanting to be on the world stage, but excluding outsiders, exhibiting a normalcy of its citizens, but maintaining inhumane prison camps, keeping a hold onto Kim family rule, but wanting to be a modern leader of a modern nation, all through propaganda, mythology, power, and fear.
This small nation of 25 million has waltzed on the world stage for over 70 years, despite all odds. The key to North Korea's survival is totalitarian control and a hereditary bloodline that dictates the next leader.
North Korea has defied all expectations and predictions for decades. Their system is one that, by rights should have collapsed decades ago. It survived the end of the Soviet Union and the move of China into becoming a capitalist powerhouse. There was a huge famine that was debilitating in North Korea.
In one of the few remaining communist and military dictatorships in the world, there are three constants. A Kim has always ruled. Anyone questioning their rule is swiftly killed or sent to hard labor. And any influence or knowledge of the outside world is prohibited.
We call North Korea a communist country. They call it a socialist country. But I really see it as an absolute monarchy and a royal dynasty of sorts, with the Kim family as the royal family.
The very first Kim to rule, Kim Il-sung, took a page from the Soviet Union's playbook and began to create his own socialist paradise.
Kim Il-sung was installed as the president of this newly formed state of North Korea in 1948. And he was supposed to be a kind of lackey for Joseph Stalin there in North Korea. But he very quickly set about developing a cult of personality around him that was independent of the Soviet system in a way that worried even the Soviets in the 1960s. They went well beyond anything that even Stalin did. But they also borrowed very heavily from other traditions in the region. So they borrowed Confucian traditions from China that had prized hierarchy and maleness, seniority there. They also took some parts of the Chosun dynasty that had been the last kind of imperial system on the Korean peninsula before then. They also borrowed quite heavily from Christianity. So he kind of picked and chose from all sorts of traditions to create a whole new kind of cult of personality that he thought could kind of gain a following in that area.
Kim Il-sung, the founder of the country, was essentially treated, seen, and continues to be seen as a semi-god, if not God. And this all falls within the Kim Il-sung-ism. It's essentially a religion. So people pray to him, they thank him, and he is their God. And according to the state ideology, or the myth, the belief, this bloodline comes from the Baekdu bloodline.
It's an origin story for the ages. They claim the Kim bloodline emerges from a holy mountain on the Chinese border, Mount Baekdu. Starting with Kim Il-sung, then his son, Kim Jong-il, and now grandson, Kim Jong-un, all claiming the divine right to leadership.
This bloodline is extremely important. That's how they have the legitimacy to rule, mandate to rule. I don't think anybody else from outside of this bloodline could truly rule North Korea and have legitimacy in the eyes of the public.
Kim Il-sung built a cult of personality with a propaganda machine that saturated the entire society.
That's the case today as well. Every piece of information that's produced within North Korea is controlled by the state.
위대한 정면 돌파전 사상에 안아올린 자력 부강 자력 본영의 장점을 순천 비료 공장.
Socialist revolution, Kim family, Baekdu bloodline, keep the Korean race pure. Don't use any words that are not part of a pure Korean language. There's a North Korean calendar system where the year one, Juche year one, starts in 1912, which is the birth year of Kim Il-sung. The state's propaganda permeated throughout the society.
In the 1970s, when Kim Il-sung started to think about who was going to take over the system from him, they actually changed the North Korean constitution to say that the leadership should be from generation to generation, and really laying the groundwork for Kim Il-sung's son to take over. But they spent 25 years preparing Kim Jong-il to succeed his father, but also preparing the North Korean population and especially the regime leaders for this idea that the second generation Kim would be the successor.
김정일 당시 추진하겠습니다.
We have to recognize that in North Korea, there's only been two successions. From the founder Kim Il-sung to his son Kim Jong-il in 1994. And then when Kim Jong-il passed away in 2011, there was another succession.
Kim Jong-un took power at 28. At such a young age, the line of succession is far less secure, should something happen to him.
The problem is that Kim Jong-un does not have a male heir that is old enough to assume leadership.
An unclear succession plan leaves the Kim family and North Korea vulnerable to potential instability. A risk that got the world's attention when Kim was a no-show to commemorate his grandfather's birth on April 15th, 2020.
It's really treated like, perhaps we think of it as Christmas or New Year's. It's really the biggest holiday of the year. And for every April 15th, Kim Jong-un has gone and laid a wreath at the mausoleum where his grandfather lies in state. And he didn't do that this year.
His absence compounded by the fact that he was not seen in public for another 2 weeks ignited a firestorm of press.
There was this one North Korea-related news website in South Korea that reported that Kim was missing. Not necessarily he's dead, but something was wrong with his health. And then I think the next thing we saw was Jim Shooter of CNN citing a source in the U.S. government.
A U.S. official with direct knowledge tells me that the U.S. is now monitoring intelligence that the health of the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is in grave danger. He had a surgery, that the aftermath of that surgery, there were complications, and his health is now in grave danger.
When it comes to the health of the leader of North Korea, it is a very small circle of people who would be in the know and be able to reveal that information.
He was either fine, recuperating, or dead. And I think the reason that these rumors gained traction was because it seemed believable that he would have health problems. When you look at him, he is 36 years old. He is clearly in very bad shape for such a young man. South Korean doctors who have analyzed his appearance and his breathing and things have said that he appears to have a body mass index of about 45, which would make him morbidly obese.
Kim Jong-un finally did appear at a photo op on May 1st, putting the rumors to rest. But the seeds of doubt remained. Who would carry on the family line and be the next leader? With a regime that controls nearly every aspect of civilian, government, and military life with precision and force, it became apparent that there was no succession plan.
So that would open up just all kinds of possibilities. What if there is elite infighting or struggle, or factional struggle? So I think it does. The succession question leads to potential instability, regime instability in North Korea.
The Kim family tree, or the Paektu bloodline, is fraught with complications. There are 4 generations, with multiple contenders, each one eligible to ascend the throne.
So there's a story that before Kim Jong-il passed away, he was talking to a Russian diplomat, and he pointed out that 2 of his children seemed to have the knack and interest for political affairs, and it was Kim Jong-un and Kim Yo-jong, the sister.
She has all the incentive to try to prove that she is a strong leader as a younger sister of the leader, but also as a woman.
Kim Jong-un has supreme confidence in his sister, Kim Yo-jong. She is the person he trusts most of all because she has that same interest in this system continuing for decades to come.
Early on, Kim Yo-jong was appointed an alternate member of the Politburo, only the second woman to receive that title. The first, her aunt, Kim Kyung-hui.
Kim Yo-jong was also assuming greater positions in a variety of agencies within the North Korean government, particularly the most important ones. So the propaganda and agitation department that builds up the cult and narrative around Kim Jong-il, but also now Kim Jong-un. And even now she has taken the leadership of all inter-Korean governmental affairs. So when the North Korean delegation went to Seoul for the Pyeongchang Olympics in 2018, it was clear that she was, in effect, the head of the delegation and is now leading all inter-Korean relations.
The 2018 Olympics was like a coming out party for the young sister.
The South Korean public and media went mad. It's the first time really seeing her and someone from the regime. They were scrutinizing her looks. They liked the way she held up her chin. They thought she looked somewhat like a royalty, a little bit proud. They liked how she was wearing a simple ponytail, to her makeup. Everything about her was scrutinized in South Korea, and she was quite popular. They thought she had the right image. So she played a very important role in softening up the image for her country, for her brother, for herself.
It was an interesting opportunity for us to see what she was like. Until then, to be honest, I had seen her. She really was on the periphery, darting around behind the scenes. And so it was interesting to see her step into that role and play more of a diplomatic role as envoy on behalf of her brother.
Kim Yo-jong was seen by her brother's side during his summits with South Korean President Moon Jae-in and with President Trump in Singapore and Hanoi.
The truly amazing thing about the brief period of diplomacy that we saw in 2018 was the willingness of both Kim Yo-jong and Kim Jong-un to be portrayed live and to step out of their comfortable, protected cocoon and to step into the rest of the world, the outside world, where anything could happen. So this is a very clear departure from his father, from their father, who was notoriously shy of any kind of public appearance that wasn't staged.
Instead, they're taking a page from their grandfather Kim Il-sung's playbook, carefully controlling the message. Following the Korean War, he established state-sponsored messaging designed to secure his own power through a campaign of fear. The propaganda script was a simple lie. Imperialist Americans invaded once and will do it again. And only he can protect the country.
North Korea has very strong concerns about a hostile United States. For example, they know that President Eisenhower was contemplating the use of atomic weapons in North Korea if China and North Korea were to reinvade after the armistice. North Korea was also very devastated by the 600,000 tons of bombs that the US dropped in North Korea during the Korean War that basically left no building standing and turned North Korea into a desert. So from that experience, I think that really got into North Korea's psyche, and that's probably one of the central premises of how they think about their security going forward.
Decades of fear has fueled the development of the fourth largest military in the world, including a nuclear arsenal and ICBMs capable of reaching the continental United States. And at the helm of it all is the Kim family dynasty. By 1980, Kim Jong-il was being groomed as successor. As head of propaganda, he used the office to write himself into the origin story, alongside his father.
The propaganda came to say that Kim Jong-il, who was actually born in a logging camp in the Siberian part of the Soviet Union, they said that he was born on Mount Paektu in a wooden hut, and a bright star shone in the sky that night, which would be very familiar to anybody who had been raised in a Christian tradition, which Kim Il-sung actually had been.
Upon the sudden death of the founding Kim in 1994, while the country mourned, Kim Jong-il assumed power without missing a beat. He ruled with the same iron fist. While the people suffered and starved, he carried on the propaganda myth of the strongman for all the world. Then, over a decade into his reign, he mysteriously disappears from public view.
On September 9th, 2008, we were fully expecting Kim Jong-il to appear and wave to the crowds at the 60th anniversary of the founding of North Korea, major milestone anniversary. So in Korean culture, we call any 60th birthday the Hwangap, so it's a big deal. We fully expected him to be there waving from the viewing platform, and I still remember I was watching a feed of North Korean state TV, live feed, and the camera panned to the viewing platform, and he wasn't there. he had suffered a stroke, was perhaps in a coma, that we wouldn't know for weeks. And so that goes to show how hard it is to get any information about North Korea.
The whole regime realized they needed to turbocharge the succession plan. So from then on, we saw Kim Jong-un, the third son of Kim Jong-il, being rolled out as the natural heir apparent to this dynasty. And the way they did this was really by emphasizing the bloodline. So they started really hammering this line that Kim Jong-un had this Paektu blood flowing through his veins and that he was uniquely qualified to be able to lead the North Korean regime. And so this is how Kim Jong-un today claims legitimacy to lead. This is the reason why Kim Jong-un rides those white horses on Mount Paektu. He wants to remind everybody that he has this claim that very, very few other people do.
The propaganda paid off. At the young age of 28, Kim Jong-un became the next leader of North Korea after his father died. But the fact remained. He had very little experience, and that made him vulnerable. In a military dictatorship, the person who controls the money and the weapons is the leader. Military credibility is considered essential for that role.
Kim Jong-un himself, who had no military experience, they had to sort of manufacture things to give him that kind of military experience. So in 2010, when the North Koreans sank a South Korean corvette, Cheonan, killing 46 South Korean sailors, that was supposedly done under Kim Jong-un's name. That was under his direction to give him sort of credibility with the elites and the public.
To add to his legitimacy, an aunt, Kim Kyung-hui, and her husband, Jang Song-taek, acted as unofficial regents to the young Kim. Jang brought in billions to the regime by setting up markets abroad, mostly in China. The aunt was an influential and trusted advisor behind the scenes.
Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il, relied on his sister as a support network, as someone who's loyal to Kim Jong-il. There's not many people that you can trust in North Korea if you're the leader of North Korea. So family members are very important, and Kim Kyung-hee, Kim Jong-il's sister, was an important person that Kim Jong-il trusted, that he sought advice from, that someone who played a supporter role for Kim Jong-il.
There is a very strong precedent for a sister as a supporter. And in fact, we saw way back the aunt and the sister, so Kim Kyung-hee and Kim Yo-jong, were out riding horses together. It looked like the aunt was training the sister as much as she was training Kim Jong-un to take over this role.
Kim Yo-jong is a confidant, the one person that Kim Jong-un absolutely trusts in North Korea.
As much confidence Kim Jong-un seemingly has in his sister, there's one big thing keeping her from becoming the next leader if her brother dies unexpectedly.
North Korea is an extremely patriarchal system. This regime has always been run by men, and particularly old men. So it's really impossible to think that a young woman could take over, that Kim Yo-jong could be the next successor of North Korea. But having said that, it's also impossible to think that she wouldn't take over, because there just really is nobody else in the family who has any kind of public profile, any kind of prominent role in the regime, and who would be able to step into that top leadership role in the way that she could.
I truly believe this Paektu bloodline, which is so important, trumps this patriarchal society. So I understand this patriarchy is important, it's a male-dominated society, and there's no doubt about that. But what's more important to rule? What do you need to have to rule North Korea? You need the bloodline.
In the spring of 2020, Kim Jong-un made a point of showing the world that he was alive and well after his brief disappearance from the public eye. Still, the world speculated who could be the next successor. And then, his sister made an unprecedented show of force.
김여정 조선노동당 중앙위원회 제1부부장 담화.
She threatened to end the 2018 Inter-Korean Treaty if the South did not stop activist defectors sending anti-regime messages into the North.
Kim Yo-jong said some very harsh and disparaging things about the Moon administration.
뿌리 깊은 사대주의 군성에 시달리며 어역과 자멸이로 줄다름치고 있는 이토록 비굴하고 굴종적인 상대와 더 이상 북남 관계를 논할 수 없다는 것이 굳어질 대로 굳어진 우리의 판단이다.
And then also did things like blowing up the Inter-Korean Liaison Office, cutting off the communication channels. It's also very telling that she basically said that she is giving the North Korean military permission to come up with next steps for, being aggressive against South Korea.
배신자들과 쓰레기들이 저지른 죄값을 정확히 계산하기 위한 단계별 대적 사업 계획들을 심의하고.
So I think that was very important because publicly she is showing that she has the power to instruct the North Korean military to devise and implement next steps.
쓰레기들의 반공화국 적대 행위를 묵인하여 북남 관계를 파국적인 종착점으로 몰아왔다.
That is a part of Kim Yo-jong being groomed to exert control over the North Korean military if there were a problem with Kim Jong-un.
The Moon administration acquiesced and placed restrictions on activist defectors.
Nothing that's coming out of North Korea is sort of haphazard. They have thought this through. I think Kim Jong-un has in his mind grooming his sister, and this is sort of the start. She needs to show that she's tough, she has what it takes, that she can be tough against the South Koreans, she can be tough against the Americans. So I think more provocations will come out of North Korea, and it will have Kim Yo-jong's name on it.
But she is walking a tightrope, because even trusted family members can get on the wrong side of the regime. When Kim Jong-un took power, he saw threats everywhere. There were hundreds of purges and executions of anyone Kim saw as a threat, mostly old guard loyalists to his father. 1 year into his reign, he had his own uncle, Jang Song-taek, killed for amassing too much power within the system.
He was taken out. There were bleachers set up so that regime officials could watch as he was shot, I believe, with an anti-aircraft gun in front of this audience to send a very powerful deterrent message to anybody who might think about, rivaling Kim Jong-un for the leadership.
In Kim Jong-un's mind, his older half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, posed the next threat.
Kim Jong-nam showed absolutely no desire whatsoever to take on that leadership role. He had been critical of the system. He had been living outside of North Korea for about 15 years. In terms of Kim Jong-un's paranoia and his desire to kind of shore up the system and make sure that his core family and him in particular was fully in charge, this is the reason why he had his own half-brother, very brutally assassinated in full public view of the security cameras in Kuala Lumpur airport.
Both of these were very strong messages to members of the Kim family and members of the elite that you either play along and you do what Kim Jong-un says, or he will make sure that you pay the price. And so those were both incredibly chilling messages that would not have been lost among the elites as well as members of the Kim family.
After half-brother Kim Jong-nam was murdered, his son, Kim Han-sol, went into hiding. Despite spending most of his life abroad, he still feared for his life.
I'm sure Kim Jong-un is looking for Kim Han-sol to get rid of him and any potential future successor. Kim Han-sol is a lot older than his own children right now. So if something were to happen to Kim Jong-un, and if, let's say, the China and the U.S. backed somebody like Kim Han-sol, that could potentially happen. So I think if I'm Kim Jong-un, he'll be, Kim Han-sol is in danger.
My father has been killed a few days ago. I'm currently with my mother and my sister. And, we hope this gets better soon.
It's a real-life Game of Thrones.
Next up on the family tree, the globe-trotting, concert-going older brother, Kim Jong-chol.
He's not a credible person from the elite's perspective because you want a strong leader. And he was already considered, Kim Jong-chol was already considered to be not a strong leader who is uninterested in politics, who's a music fan, who's too effeminate.
With no other male siblings in the running, another potential challenger within the bloodline is the uncle, Kim Pyong-il.
Kim Pyong-il was a half-brother of Kim Jong-il. They had different mothers. So Kim Pyong-il presents a very interesting case. He is a member of the Kim family who bears the Paektu lineage. His father is Kim Il-sung. He looks similar to Kim Il-sung. And I do think Kim Jong-il saw him as a competitor for the throne. Kim Jong-il, however, he won the battle for leadership and sent Kim Pyong-il overseas as a diplomat. And Kim Pyong-il spent decades overseas.
In a surprise turn, Kim Jong-un recently recalled his uncle to Pyongyang. No one is sure why.
Who knows why Kim Jong-un brought his uncle back to North Korea? I think the real reason is to make sure that Kim Pyong-il does not defect and that Kim Jong-un can keep a tap on him.
A clear line to the next leader remains uncertain. Such a void could lead to chaos. In North Korea, daily life is influenced by over 70 years of Kim family rule. A new leader outside the Paektu bloodline is unthinkable. But when you look at the family tree, there's no clear choice. Kim Yo-jong is young and female. The brother, Kim Jong-chol, is perceived as weak. The nephew, Kim Han-sol, is unknown within North Korea. The uncle, Kim Pyong-il, lacks the relationships within the system to gather power.
It's court intrigues, modern-day court intrigue.
One prominent figure in the North Korean court, not found on the family tree, is Chae Rong-hae. He wields great power and influence in the regime and should not be overlooked as a potential successor.
He spent some time in the military, but really he's been a bureaucrat for the last 30, 40 years. He's the first vice chair of the State Affairs Commission and widely recognized as the #2 in command in North Korea.
Chae Young-hae is political royalty in North Korea. He comes from the perfect lineage for a North Korean official. His father, Chae Hyun, fought alongside Kim Il-sung, fighting the Japanese. And so he has what they call that partisan street cred. And so he has that political heritage and ancestry. He's a trusted friend of the Kim family, but he's still an outsider.
Chae Rong-hae does not have Paektu bloodline, and that's the valuable thing that Chae Rong-hae is missing. That said, I think if anybody can challenge Kim Yo-jong becoming the next successor, will be Chae Rong-hae because he is the second most powerful man in North Korea.
There are rumors that his second son was married to Kim Yo-jong, so there could be some interesting connections there in terms of a future power dynamic.
a smart play for the North Koreans is for Kim Yo-jong to take over. She has the right bloodline and closely aided by someone like Choi Dong-hae, who has experience, who has patronage network, who comes from the right family. And if they could work together, that would be a smart thing for the North Koreans. That would lead to, stable transition.
Any uncertainty during a time of transition could potentially cause a chaotic period that would worry South Korea and not be tolerated by China or the U.S.
The concern for the U.S. government is instability. If you were to have a situation where Kim Jong-un passes away suddenly and there is no clear successor, then that presents problems. China is also concerned about instability along its borders with North Korea as well. Their approach to North Korea is that they want no war, no instability, and no nuclear weapons, but in that order. And so I think they would also be concerned about a crisis of succession, the inability of the North Korean government to control its population, warring factions, loose nuclear weapons, a fallout from poor nuclear security, a famine in the country. Any of these scenarios could cause a problem along China's border, and they would want to approach that very quickly.
And they have good reason for concern. The North Korean people have starved before. In the 1990s, a financial crisis struck. Massive flooding and the loss of their main benefactor, the Soviet Union, caused the central distribution system to collapse. They could no longer provide for the people. It is believed that over 500,000 lives were lost in the famine that followed.
The North Korean people realized that they couldn't rely on the North Korean government anymore. They had to basically rely on themselves. And so they started foraging for food. They started to sell anything that they could get their hands on, make stuff and sell them in the new markets that were popping up across the country. And basically this resulted in survival entrepreneurialism on a mass scale.
Fast forward to now in 2020, there are hundreds of massive markets. Now they are regulating these markets, they are taxing these markets, and they're trying to control, but they're not getting rid of them because there's no way, there's no alternative to provide for all of its citizens.
By allowing these markets to exist, the people rely less on the Kim family. But could this shift in power cause regime collapse, where the people gain control? Every aspect of North Korean life is so tightly controlled, the outside world is not to be known or seen by the vast majority of citizens. But that is slowly changing.
Over the last 10, 20 years, North Korean people have been getting access to foreign media, including South Korean television programs, Chinese films, e-books and so on from the outside world, things that are being smuggled in on USB sticks and micro SD cards, things that North Korean government doesn't want them to see. And once the North Korean people learn things and know things about the outside world and their own country that the North Korean leadership doesn't want them to know, they can't unlearn them. And, curiosity is an idea that can't be killed. North Korean people have been able to open things up from the bottom up gradually. And one of the most important changes there, I think, is in information. And even though there's so much risk attached to that, this phenomenon has actually been spreading and growing. It makes them question certain fundamental things that they've been taught from an early age. And this is something that is irreversible.
The North Korean people struggle with children who question things and young people who are not happy. So, you have to wonder whether Kim Jong-un has the kind of loyalty that his grandfather could safely rely on when he was leader.
Until now, the system has been able to stay intact using repression, punishing people in very extreme ways if they commit political crimes like questioning the leadership.
North Korea is the most closed and repressive country in the world, and 25 million North Korean people face the most authoritarian government in the world, and this situation has been going for 70 years now. It's absolutely incredible to think that there are maybe around 100,000 North Korean people in political prison camps, which are reminiscent of the Soviet gulags, or some people would say even the Nazi concentration camps.
This is how the North Korean system has survived. So far, they have been able to keep it under control, but every time you take a step away from this foundation myth, it becomes that little bit harder to perpetuate it.
Eventually, we could see history repeat itself in North Korea as it did in other parts of the world, which is groups of people who are like-minded in a shared pursuit of achieving a better society, happier society, a freer society for its people.
There is everyday disorganized resistance. North Korean people resist authority and the government in their own way, in their daily life. And as that builds, it maybe creates the seeds for civil society space, more cooperation between people, and just more spread of subversive ideas and desires for the future. Human history teaches us to be humble about what we think we can know about how things will play out, especially in terms of political developments. These things inherently surprise us. Countries are stable until they're unstable.
I think we're not going to see anything similar to Pyongyang Spring or Pyongyang Square anytime soon. And this is mainly because the deterrent measures, the punishment mechanisms is just so effective. And North Korea is, as a dictatorship, they get an A+. They are an incredibly effective dictatorship. No one is immune from being used by the state, being exploited by the state, or being assassinated by the state.
I've asked people who've escaped from North Korea about why there is no kind of people's uprising, why there is no revolution in North Korea. They all point to this. They say that if you disagree with the system, you try to escape from it. You don't try to change it from within.
For those who opt to escape, the chosen path is often through China. Guided by an underground network, constantly fearing detection, pushing themselves to exhaustion. It's an arduous path to freedom.
I think it's essential to try to understand and listen to as many North Korean defectors as possible. Because the regime and all the heinous, brutal ways that the regime maintains to keep the society as it is one thing. But at the complete other end of the spectrum of trying to understand North Korea as a whole are the people who live it and the people who overcome such repressive life.
So where is the tipping point in North Korea? What is the moment where the people of North Korea say, we've had enough with living in this system of lies. We know the outside world is richer and, freer, and we want some of that for ourselves.
For the Kim family, maintaining control is a delicate dance. Their dynasty has ruled for over 70 years. And the key to its ongoing survival is succession.
I think we have many years before we'll see that issue come to a head. Perhaps it'll come sooner than Kim Jong-un would like. But he is banking on the idea of it being decades before he hands power to the next generation.